Under the Norman and Angevin kings, England did not undergo a quiet evolution, but a forceful transformation. After 1066, new rulers systematically dismantled the old order, redefining land, power and loyalty. This period marked the moment when England ceased to be a regional kingdom and entered the harsh arena of European power politics. With Norman rule came an unprecedented concentration of royal authority. Castles spread across the landscape, taxation became more regular, and written records and royal officials formed the backbone of governance. The king's will was no longer confined to the royal court. It reached village squares and local communities. This new system promised order and stability, but it also imposed heavier burdens and a far stricter social hierarchy. Under the Angevin kings, the picture grew even broader. England was ruled alongside vast continental territories, drawing its kings into constant warfare, rebellion, and conflict with the church. Law became the most powerful instrument of royal control, courts multiplied, and the idea of the king's justice entered everyday life. Yet this expansion of authority provoked resistance and led to crises that would permanently limit royal power. In this video we explore how England was reshaped under Norman and Angevin rule, who truly held power, and how this era laid the foundations of the English state. If you enjoy in-depth history content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing history to life. At the heart of English politics in the Middle Ages sat one question that never really went away. Who had the right to be king? In the era we're looking at, that question was rarely just an English problem, because the English king also claimed authority over major lands in France. So whenever England argued about succession, France was almost always part of the same storm. From the late 11th century into the early 13th, there was almost no moment when the ruling family's right to the throne was challenged by an entirely new dynasty. The real problem was which member of the same royal house should rule. Surprisingly, the crown passed cleanly from father to oldest surviving son only a couple of times. Much more often, kings died without a legitimate son, or brothers and nephews stepped forward, or a settlement forced a change in direction. The result was a pattern where side-branch succession was normal, and direct father-to-son inheritance was the exception. That instability mattered because high politics was, in practice, family politics with armies. Births, marriages and deaths did not just shape private life, they shaped the fate of kingdoms. A king needed sons to secure the future, but multiple sons often meant rival power centres. As boys grew into commanders, they wanted land, authority and independence, and they could turn against their father or against each other. Mothers and stepmothers could push one son's cause, broker peace, or inflame conflict. Then the king would die, a new ruler would emerge, and the cycle would begin again. The new king had to keep brothers quiet, produce heirs, and prepare for the day those heirs became threats. In a realm split by the Channel and tied to French politics, these tensions became even harder to contain. One early turning point came when the first great conqueror of England died and left behind not one calm heir but several adult sons. His lands were effectively divided. One son took the continental inheritance, another took England, and the youngest received vast wealth. That division did not bring stability. Instead, it fed decades of conflict until the youngest eventually gathered the whole inheritance into his own hands through war and captivity. Later, another king died with several sons, and although one son inherited the entire dominion, the balance remained fragile. The moment weakness appeared, rivalry returned, and ambition had space to grow. Even more dangerous was the situation when a king died without a legitimate male heir. In two cases, a brother seized the throne quickly, but the speed of the takeover did not prevent civil conflict. The most explosive crisis came when a king died, leaving only a legitimate daughter. Powerful people hesitated, partly because they feared the political consequences of a marriage, and the rise of a foreign power around her, and partly because Western Europe had almost no tradition of a woman ruling alone as monarch. A male cousin with a plausible blood claim moved fast, secured the crown, and tried to make the new order feel permanent. But the rival claim did not disappear. With strong supporters and access to military power, the opposition kept fighting, and the country sank into a long, brutal struggle that became remembered as a time when lawful government seemed to collapse into war and improvisation. When the conflict finally ended, the winning side treated the previous reign as an illegitimate interruption. The new regime acted as if proper rule had stopped with the earlier king's death and only resumed when their own ruler took control. That attitude mattered because it shaped policy, land disputes, and the rewriting of legitimacy. In practical terms, every change of ruler became a high-risk transition. Careers rose and fell. Ministers were replaced, punished, or stripped of wealth. Communities and great lords rushed to secure confirmations of their lands and privileges because the new king's voice carried more immediate force than any older promise. The first months of a reign became a political marketplace where loyalty, advantage, and fear all moved at once. The only time in this era when a child took the throne came during a national emergency. A young boy was crowned while civil war raged, and foreign forces threatened the realm. There was no real alternative if the dynasty was to survive. A regency was formed around experienced magnates and churchmen, and that committee government managed step by step to drive back the invaders, pull rebels away from the enemy camp, and rebuild routine authority. Medieval writers often warned that a land ruled by a child was doomed to misery, yet this regency period proved that, under the right leadership, a government of seasoned hands could sometimes function better than the personal rule of many adult kings. So the story of succession in this period is not just a list of rulers. It is a repeated pattern. Inheritance uncertainty fuels family rivalry. Family rivalry becomes civil conflict, and civil conflict reshapes the kingdom's politics at every level. England's crown was rarely contested by outsiders, yet it was almost constantly fought over by those closest to it. After 1066, England entered a new political reality. The man wearing the English crown was also a major lord in France, and that single fact shaped English power struggles for centuries. For a long time, English politics could not be separated from French politics, because the king's survival, wealth, and status depended on what happened on both sides of the Channel. We can see this cross-channel story in three broad stages. First came the Anglo-Norman era, when England and Normandy functioned like one political world. The ruling elite was largely French-speaking, and many nobles held land in both places. Loyalties could split during dynastic quarrels, but the realm was still imagined as a connected whole. Then a new pattern formed when the Anjavan dynasty rose. Through inheritance and marriage, the English king came to control a chain of territories stretching across huge parts of western France. England was no longer just tied to Normandy. It became one piece inside a sprawling collection of lordships that ran from the southern borders of France all the way toward the British Isles. In that world, it was normal for kings to spend most of their time on the continent, because the richest lands, the fiercest rivalries, and the most urgent threats were often there. Finally, the third stage arrived, when French royal power grew sharper and more aggressive. Step by step, the kings of France dismantled this cross-channel power, taking key cities and regions until the English king's continental possessions shrank to a smaller southern core, increasingly focused on the southwest. This long entanglement meant something important. Rulers did not think in modern national terms. They did not separate England's interest from the king's interest. What mattered was the dynasty's survival and expansion, and that goal was tied to castles, alliances, inheritances, and battlefield results in France as much as to authority in England. The early conqueror who became king had already spent decades as a French duke before taking England. His instincts were shaped by the hard logic of feudal competition, building strongholds, bargaining with marriage alliances, rewarding supporters with land, crushing enemies through intimidation or imprisonment, and constantly manoeuvring among rival lords. Because of that, English kings in this era were often absent from England. The strongest rulers were usually the ones who could afford to spend long stretches in France, personally managing difficult territories and commanding wars. The weaker ones tended to be trapped in England because they had lost control across the Channel. Over time, the pattern became clear. Success on the continent pulled kings away from England, while failure forced them to remain at home. Even kings born in England often treated France as their main stage, because their identity and power were tied to great lordships there. Out of the conquest came a new elite, a cross-channel aristocracy. Many of the greatest families owned estates in both England and Normandy. Some even held lands beyond Normandy, which made them tied to multiple overlords and multiple political worlds at once. A single magnate could have castles and revenues scattered across England, Normandy, Wales and Ireland, turning the Channel into a busy corridor rather than a boundary. That brought enormous opportunity, but it also created constant strain. Absentee rule was unavoidable, which meant deputies and duplicate administrations. Travel and shipping had to be organised. Inheritance plans had to account for dying in either realm. Even family life carried a unique tension, because long absences and divided households created anxieties that people openly discussed. The greatest danger came whenever England and Normandy fell under different rulers. In those moments, nobles with land on both sides faced a nightmare choice. Serve two masters and risk being branded a traitor by both, split the family's inheritance into English and Norman branches, or push for the restoration of unity. Many became unionists in practice, because their wealth depended on the realm staying connected. That is why succession crises at the top could trigger rapid, nervous movements among the nobility. A coronation, a rumour of a rival claimant, or a sudden defeat in France could force aristocrats to change sides overnight to protect their estates. One family's experience shows how personal and political these storms could become. A great castle and its lands might be granted after one conquest, confiscated after another, reassigned during civil war, and restored again under a new king. A lord might be loyal one year, punished the next, and forgiven later when the crown needed allies. Under pressure, royal officials could seize a noble's goods and order inventories of his property. Then, when the political winds shifted again, the same man might be welcomed back and restored in exchange for renewed allegiance. This was not a rare story. It was the lived reality of cross-channel aristocrats whose fortunes rose and fell with the union or separation of the two worlds. All of this played out inside a wider French landscape where power was fragmented. The King of France was not yet an overwhelming monarch. Real control often belonged to dukes and counts who minted coins, appointed church leaders, and ruled their territories like independent princes. Normandy sat among rivals: Flanders, Blois, Anjou, and Brittany. Some were enemies, some were temporary allies, and many were both over time. Anjou in particular became a dangerous competitor, especially when it teamed up with the French crown or encouraged rebellions inside Normandy. The response from Norman rulers was relentless campaigning, shifting alliances, and constant strategic pressure. Even geography added to the instability. Normandy did not have strong natural frontiers. Its landscapes blended into neighbouring regions and border politics were messy. To the west, Brittany was divided and turbulent, and cross-channel links pulled Breton nobles into English affairs. Breton participation in the conquest earned them lands in England, which meant conflict in England could echo into Brittany and back again. A revolt in England could turn into a fortress resistance across the water. A French king's intervention on the continent could change the outcome of a crisis that began in an English shire. In this world, the Channel was not a wall. It was a bridge that carried wars, alliances, and ambitions in both directions. After the Norman Conquest, the Channel did not separate two worlds, it connected them. Across northern France, the most sensitive fault lines were not national borders in the modern sense, but zones where ambitious lordships collided and where a single fortress could tip the balance of power. East of Brittany lay Maine, a region that became a constant battleground because it sat exactly where Norman expansion met Angevin ambition. One generation could see Norman control imposed by force, the next could see local barons push back, and then a new political bargain would pull the county into another orbit. Maine's fate mattered because it altered the map of pressure around Normandy. When Maine was drawn into the Angevin sphere, it did not just change a title on parchment. It created a longer, sharper frontier. Normandy now faced a powerful rival directly along a broad border, and the struggle became more dangerous and more continuous. A similar contest played out in the Vexin, a smaller territory, but one with enormous strategic weight. This was the corridor between Rouen and Paris. Whoever dominated it could threaten the other's heartland with speed. The region had long been divided into an eastern section tied to the French royal zone and a western section linked to Normandy. When the local county line ended, the French crown moved quickly to absorb what it could, and the Vexin turned into a permanent pressure point. Raids, burned towns, and sudden strikes were not side stories here. They were the method of politics. These realities explain why the kings of England, who were also dukes in France, had to live like continental warlords. Their central obsession was not only governing England, but surviving inside the ruthless competition of French principalities. In the early 12th century, the struggle reached a dramatic intensity. A newly crowned king in England could face an invasion launched from France by a rival claimant from within his own family. A treaty might pause the crisis, but it rarely ended it. The decisive answer was often conquest, capture, and the removal of a challenger from the board. Even after victory, peace was never secure. The French crown, far from being a passive overlord, could act as a combatant, stirring unrest, backing exiles, and pressing claims in contested regions. Meanwhile, Anjou's rise added an extra layer of danger. Once Anjou effectively held Maine, Normandy could be threatened from multiple directions at once, especially when rival powers coordinated their pressure. This was the nightmare scenario. Attacks from different fronts combined with internal disloyalty inside Normandy itself. When coalitions formed, wars became brutal and personal. Rebellious barons could link up with outside allies, castles could turn into magnets for conflict, and a single battle could decide the fate of entire factions. Royal forces learned to use the tools that worked. Disciplined household troops, archers who could break a cavalry charge before it reached full impact, and punishments designed to terrify as much as to defeat. Victories could restore control, yet every succession problem or sudden death could reopen the struggle. Then one disaster changed everything: the death of the king's heir at sea. With the obvious successor gone, rival claimants gained new credibility, and the French king found it easier to rally support around an alternative. Once again, storms gathered in northern France. The king responded with diplomacy, marrying his dynasty into powerful neighbours, and with war striking deep into enemy territory to show strength and intimidate potential defectors. But even this kind of dominance came with anxiety. Late in life, new family tensions erupted and old patterns returned. A powerful son-in-law, discontented barons, fortified castles, confiscations, and a ruler who could never truly relax. Out of that pressure, Cucker emerged the next political world, what historians later call the Angevin Empire. It began when the old king died and his plans were ignored. A cousin seized the English crown, and the first question became whether Normandy would accept him too. The problem was sharpened by a threatening reality. The disinherited heiress was married to the Count of Anjou, the traditional rival on Normandy's border. Almost immediately, Angevin forces began taking bites out of the duchy, occupying key places and linking up with old enemies of the previous regime. When the new king tried to defend Normandy, his weakness showed. His army fractured along fault lines of loyalty and mercenary tension. Forced into a truce and payments, he left Normandy and never returned. That withdrawal invited a slow, methodical takeover. As political confidence collapsed among the king's supporters, Angevin control expanded until Rouen itself was secured, and Normandy was formally recognised as held by the Angevin count. The cross-channel world split once more, but the story did not end with separation. The son of Anjou and the disinherited heiress refused to accept a divided inheritance. He secured Normandy first, then pressed for England, and then transformed the map of Europe by marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine. With that marriage, the ruler who held England and Normandy also controlled a vast southern duchy, a chain of territories now stretched across France, on a scale no earlier Duke King had possessed. It was a sudden realignment so dramatic that old rivals became parts of the same dominion almost overnight. Yet this new conglomerate worked differently from the older Anglo-Norman realm. Normandy had been deeply tied to England through a cross-channel aristocracy and long-standing patterns of administration. The Angevin and Aquitanian lands did not fuse with England in the same way. They remained distinct, often unruly, and required constant enforcement. Normandy became the hinge that held the whole structure together, while England provided title, treasure, and political weight. For the French monarchy, this Angevin accumulation was a wall-blocking expansion. As long as the great rivers and key corridors were held by Angevin rulers, the French crown could not grow beyond its core zone. Early on, the conflict often looked like border warfare, raids, burned villages, fortified castles, and truces that lasted only until the next crisis. Vassals could appeal over their lord's head to the French king, and every dispute became a test of authority. The game was endless, and it demanded constant attention. Then a stronger French king came to the throne and changed the tempo. The new strategy was not merely to raid, but to dismantle. The most effective weapon was not always an army, it was dynasty itself. Angevin family quarrels offered leverage, and the French king became skilled at turning sons against fathers, brothers against brothers, heirs against kings. When the Angevin ruler finally collapsed under pressure, the alliance that had broken him dissolved as soon as succession was complete. The new Angevin king was a far better soldier, but even he could not stop the tide entirely. During crusade and captivity, enemies moved, territory was lost, and the empire began to feel exposed. After the death of the warrior king, the empire's weak point became fatal. The next ruler faced a contested succession, a rival heir supported by France, and barons who calculated loyalty like a business decision. At first, speed and ceremony created an illusion of stability, but one marriage triggered a chain reaction. Local lords rebelled, appealed to the French king, and the French king exploited a basic rule of feudal politics. A vassal could be summoned to court and judged. A king who was also a vassal now faced an impossible dilemma: refuse the summons and risk forfeiture, attend and accept humiliation and danger. When the summons was refused, the French court declared the Angevin ruler stripped of his French lands. Invasion followed. The Angevin king won a dramatic victory and seized key prisoners, but his next moves were a disaster. Mercy given to dangerous enemies only encouraged new rebellion. Brutality against a rival heir unleashed outrage and revolt. Confidence evaporated. Territories fell away without a fight because garrisons no longer believed help would come. Even a mighty new fortress could not save a duchy if the political foundation beneath it crumbled. The fall of Rouen marked the end of the northern core of the empire. Yet even then, nothing felt final. The English crown did not easily accept the loss, and the years that followed were consumed by attempts at recovery. War demands deepened domestic tension, and those tensions fed the crisis that erupted into revolt and civil war. France even carried the struggle onto English soil. The cross-channel connection had been weakened, not erased. While these vast territorial struggles played out, power inside England still revolved around the royal court. Politics was personal. It depended on who had access to the king, who could win favour, and who could survive the dangers of being close. Patronage was the currency of that world. Get too close and you could be destroyed. Stay too far away and you would be forgotten. Courts were unstable because favour could shift suddenly, and when it did, it could ruin even the most established men. We can see this danger in the way kings arrested powerful figures without warning, or in the way a once favoured family could be hunted down, stripped of lands, and punished with terrifying cruelty. Court life offered rise and reward, but it also demanded constant fear management. One practical way to understand who mattered most at court is to watch who repeatedly appears beside the king in official acts. The inner circle was made up of royal family, bishops, great lords, household officers, and trusted administrators. Patronage flowed in many forms. Land grants were rare and painful for the crown, but offices, wardships, and marriage rights created a flexible pipeline of reward. Control over the heirs of major estates and the power to arrange or sell marriages meant the king could enrich favourites without permanently surrendering royal land. Kings could also reward by forgiving debts, cancelling demands, or easing penalties. Sometimes these remissions were granted not only for the beneficiary, but for love of a powerful courtier, showing how influence itself could be converted into profit. This system could build new dynasties. A minor knight could rise into a major baron through service, warfare, administration, and a well-placed marriage engineered by royal favour. Another royal servant could climb from modest holdings to become the chief administrator of the realm, consolidating wealth and status step by step until he stood among the great. Such careers fueled ambition, but they also fueled envy. Competition at court was constant, and the fear of being outpaced quickly hardened into hostility. Under that pressure, friendship was rare, and even laughter could vanish under the weight of suspicion and greed. And sometimes the brutal logic of patronage is captured in a dark story. A man promised the next great honour at court and then returned carrying the severed head of the current holder to claim the reward. Whether legend or warning, the message is clear. In a world where power depended on proximity to the king, and where land and titles were prizes, court politics could turn ambition into violence in a single step. In the great halls and palaces of Norman and Angevin England, severed heads did not really lie on the floor. That image belongs to imagination and legend. What was real, however, was the ruthless competition between rivals. Power at court was never shared calmly. It was contested, guarded, and constantly threatened. At certain moments, this rivalry hardened into open factional conflict, especially when the king was absent or authority was uncertain. When the king was away, court politics intensified. During Richard's absence on crusade, the government of England fell into the hands of his chancellor. His rule quickly alienated many of the most powerful men in the realm. A small circle stood by him, bound through personal loyalty and family ties, but the majority of the baronage moved against him. Led by the king's brother and supported by senior churchmen, they organised a show of force that ended with the chancellor fleeing the country. This was not a constitutional struggle or a clash of principles. It was a battle of ambition, jealousy, and access to power. Contemporary observers understood this clearly. Those who opposed the chancellor were driven not by concern for the kingdom, but by resentment of his dominance. He had risen too quickly, rewarded his own circle too generously, and made enemies by holding power too long. Envy hardened into hostility, and hostility into action. Even though the king still trusted him, the damage was done. His authority could never be fully restored. Most political struggles at court were less dramatic but no less dangerous. They unfolded quietly through whispered advice, private meetings, and careful manipulation of the king's attention. A striking example occurred early in Stephen's reign. The machinery of government was still controlled by a powerful clerical family that had dominated royal administration under the previous king. Their wealth, castles, and large retinues provoked resentment from the king's closest lay companions. These courtiers began a campaign of persuasion, telling the king that the bishops were not strengthening his rule, but undermining it. Their castles, they claimed, were potential fortresses of rebellion. Stephen hesitated. Arresting senior churchmen was risky and controversial. But the pressure never stopped. The king was urged again and again to trust those closest to him, those who shared his private thoughts. Eventually worn down by constant insistence, he agreed. The result was a sudden coup at court. The bishops were seized, their castles taken, and their control over the government ended. Their fall reshaped the balance of power and marked a turning point in Stephen's troubled reign. Episodes like this reveal the true nature of court politics. Everything depended on proximity to the king, who was inside the circle, who had fallen out of favour, who was envied, and who was feared. Displaying success too openly could be fatal. Losing the king's ear could destroy a career overnight. This atmosphere of rivalry and suspicion was the permanent condition of political life. Within this world, queens played a significant and often underestimated role. Court politics revolved around the ruling family, and the queen was a central figure in that family structure. For most of the 12th century, England had a queen consort. Long periods without one were rare, and usually the result of unusual circumstances. The presence of a queen-shaped court life, patronage, and dynastic politics. Across this period, queens were drawn overwhelmingly from the great families of continental Europe. Marriage was a political instrument, designed to secure alliances and stabilise relations with powerful neighbours. Under the Normans, brides came largely from northern France and nearby regions. Under the Angevin, attention shifted west and south. Royal marriage was never a domestic matter, it was always international. Some queens married men who were not yet kings, their future uncertain. Others were chosen only after their husbands had secured the crown. Only a few queens were themselves of royal blood, and fewer still came from the British Isles. Most arrived as outsiders, unfamiliar with English politics and unconnected to local factions. This often made them politically neutral figures at first. Yet neutrality did not mean insignificance. Queens could and did take sides within their own families. Mothers sometimes supported sons against fathers. Wives could become allies or opponents in dynastic conflict. These interventions were not symbolic. They involved money, soldiers, and influence. Queens were active participants in power struggles, not passive observers. They also fulfilled other crucial roles. They ensured the continuation of the dynasty, acted as regents when necessary, and managed substantial resources of their own. Two queens from the reign of Henry I illustrate how varied the queenly role could be. Henry's first wife gained a lasting reputation for holiness and generosity. Raised among religious women, she carried a deep commitment to piety into her queenship. She lived at the heart of royal power, yet practiced humility and ritual self-denial. She supported churches, encouraged learning, and showed particular concern for the sick and marginalised. Her household followed a disciplined religious rhythm, and her personal devotion became legendary. She founded charitable institutions and used her wealth to support both spiritual and practical causes. Yet she was not withdrawn from politics. When the king was absent, she exercised royal authority. She issued commands, presided over judicial matters, and acted decisively in the administration of the realm. Her writs carried the force of royal government. She was both a symbol of sanctity and a functioning ruler. When she died, praise for her character was universal, and her memory was carefully preserved. Henry's second wife presents a different picture. Her marriage followed a long period of uncertainty and was shaped by diplomatic calculation. She came from a powerful continental family whose alliances mattered deeply in the shifting politics of Northern Europe. The marriage strengthened Henry's position against potential enemies and reflected strategic concerns as much as personal ones. She never bore the king the son he desired, and this was a source of sorrow. Contemporary writers sought to console her by praising her care for the poor and her spiritual virtues. After the king's death, she remarried and became entangled, briefly and ambiguously, in the early crisis of Stephen's reign. Her actions during that moment remain difficult to interpret. She appears cautious rather than bold, protective of her estates and position rather than committed to a cause. In the end, she preserved her wealth and status even if her reputation suffered. Both queens held extensive lands. Their wealth came from multiple sources: inheritance, marriage gifts, and property assigned to them as queens. Certain estates traditionally belonged to the queen and passed from one consort to another across generations. Queens also enjoyed urban revenues, tolls, and rights tied to commerce and trade. Some locations even took their names from royal ownership. They also received income from fines and payments made to the crown. Over time, a fixed share of such offerings became customary. This revenue was administered separately through the queen's own officials, reinforcing her financial independence. With these resources, queens created their own networks of patronage. Family members benefited directly. Brothers of queens gained lands and titles. Clerics from their households rose to bishoprics. Their influence extended across both secular and ecclesiastical society. Queens were also patrons of religion and culture. They founded religious houses, supported monastic communities, aided new orders, and distributed gift widely. Their generosity reached local churches and major foundations alike. They also encouraged learning and literature. Some were highly educated themselves and attracted poets, scholars, and historians to their courts. Historical writing flourished under their patronage. Genealogies were compiled, royal histories commissioned, and saints' lives written at their request. Works in both Latin and the emerging French literary language were produced for their households. Through these efforts, queens helped shape how the past was remembered and how royal authority was presented. In this way, queens were not merely consorts. They were political actors, landholders, patrons, and cultural figures. Their influence flowed through family ties, financial power, religious generosity, and intellectual sponsorship. The court was a dangerous place, ruled by envy and ambition, but queens had the means to navigate it and, at times, to shape it in lasting ways. In many ways, Henry I's two queens fit a broader pattern we see across Norman and Angevin England. They owned lands, sponsored religious life, supported writers and churchmen, protected their households, and carried the heavy expectation of producing heirs. Yet they were also unusual. Neither of them had to navigate the most dangerous kind of dynastic politics, rivalry inside the royal family itself. One queen had only a single son who was still young when she died. The other had no children by the king at all. Neither lived through the powerful, emotionally charged role of Queen Mother. To see the difference, we only have to look at Eleanor of Aquitaine. She turned motherhood into a political force. She supported sons who rose against their father, held government together when one of those sons became king, and later fought for another son's claim even against a grandson. In her lifetime, the Queen's family role became a battlefield. A key part of that battlefield was marriage. Royal children did not marry for romance. Their unions were pieces on a political board, and the board was largely France. The alliances that mattered most were those tied to Normandy's neighbours and rivals, especially the French crown and the great regional powers around it. Earlier kings used marriage to create shields against dangerous rivals and to form pressure against enemies who threatened their lands. Over time, these marriages were repeatedly used to soften hostilities, bind rival dynasties, or isolate an opponent. When Norman and Angevin rulers tried to settle their most serious regional conflicts, marriage was often one of the most important tools. Even when a union began as a simple engagement between children, it could carry real consequences. A betrothal could change borders, shift loyalty, and determine which ruler had the stronger claim in a disputed region. We can see how this worked in contested frontier territory between Normandy and the French king. That borderland changed hands through negotiations, oaths, and warfare, but sometimes it was marriage that delivered the decisive advantage. A royal bride's dowry could restore land that had been lost in earlier diplomacy. Later, if a royal spouse died, their claims might be sold, transferred, or reassigned through a new betrothal. In this way, family arrangements became instruments of geography. Not every marriage aimed at diplomacy on the grandest scale. Some were designed to provide a younger son with wealth and a base of power, especially when he was unlikely to inherit the crown. A carefully chosen heiress could become a solution to the problem of what to do with a prince who had ambition but no throne. In practice, these marriages could create future power blocks of their own. The status of the match mattered too. A king's prestige rose when his daughters married into royal or near-royal houses. Henry II arranged striking marriages for his daughters, linking England's ruling family to major dynasties across Europe. Those unions created chains of obligation that could reach far beyond England and France. They could pull the dynasty into conflicts in distant kingdoms, spark military expeditions, and force kings to intervene abroad to protect a daughter or sister's rights. And these were not abstract entanglements. When a queen's daughter became a foreign ruler's wife, her inheritance and promises could become the justification for invasion. When a royal sister became a widow in a powerful Mediterranean kingdom, her brother might arrive with an army to enforce her financial claims. Royal marriage, in other words, could echo from one end of Europe to the other. Across the wider royal family, a consistent pattern emerges. These marriages rarely aimed at blending the dynasty into the local Anglo-Norman nobility. Instead, they focused on continental alliances, first with France and its great princely houses, and later with a wider European network. Even in later generations, the idea remained clear. The royal family's greatest bargaining chip was marriage, and it should be spent where it brought the most powerful allies. While marriage shaped the diplomatic map, another force shaped the internal political climate: the king's anger. We hear repeatedly that royal vengeance could be swift. Some kings were known for punishing disloyalty without hesitation, and the Anjavan rulers gained a reputation for explosive temper. Anger in a medieval court was not just an emotion. It could become policy. A king could openly decide to turn his hostility into action. Property could be seized, lands could be taken, livelihoods could be destroyed. The records of government are full of people paying money not merely for legal outcomes, but for peace, safety, and the return of royal favour. Sometimes the language was blunt. A man might lose his land simply because the king was furious with him. Even religious communities could be targeted. If a powerful order resisted a demand, the king could instruct officials to harass them, deny them protection, and let them be crushed by local enemies. In such moments, the boundary between lawful rule and personal vendetta blurred. This harsh edge of authority shows up in the way kings treated both enemies and subjects. Earlier royal courts were accused of moving through regions like hungry armies, draining resources, stripping communities, and leaving destruction behind. Even when the violence was less open, many government practices still treated the population as something to be controlled through pressure and fear. Hostage-taking was one of the clearest examples. Hostages were not only demanded from foreign rulers, they were also demanded from great lords inside the kingdom. The logic was simple and brutal. If a powerful man might rebel, the king would hold his family as insurance. The hostage was the living guarantee of obedience. The dangers were real. In the wider British Isles, mutilation and execution could be used as punishment, even for high-born hostages, and in some cases such brutal measures were ordered by kings who ruled in England as well. Within the kingdom, hostages were commonly tied to castles. A baron might regain a fortress only after surrendering his heir. Another might hold his lands only so long as he served well. with the unspoken threat that failure meant both the loss of property and the endangerment of family members. No king used this practice more relentlessly than John. His distrust drove him to build a dense system of guarantees. Debt bound men to him. Special promises were demanded. Hostages were taken again and again, sometimes from the same family more than once. Even loyal service could not end the pressure because each concession invited another demand. It is easy to see how this constant tightening of the rope helped create a violent backlash. When resistance finally formed, it carried a clear demand: return the hostages and end this machinery of intimidation. Given the nature of medieval society, rebellion was not rare. Kings ruled over men trained for war, surrounded by armed followers, proud of their honour and quick to respond to threats. Opposition took different forms. Sometimes it was personal and instinctive, a lord striking back because he felt slighted or blocked. Sometimes it became a broader movement behind a rival claimant from within the ruling dynasty, a brother, a son, a cousin, someone whose blood gave the rebellion a kind of legitimacy, and in rarer cases rebellion carried a programme, a set of principles and reforms that rebels demanded the king accept. These categories could overlap. A great uprising might begin with personal anger, expand into support for a rival, and end with demands that looked like ideology. But the distinction still matters, because it shows how rebellion could range from impulsive violence to organised political pressure. One early example demonstrates the classic dynastic problem. When England and Normandy were divided between two brothers, many magnates faced an impossible choice. Their lands and wealth lay on both sides of the Channel. Serving one ruler could mean losing everything held from the other. The fear was simple: obey the king in England and the duke in Normandy might punish them, or obey the duke and the English king might confiscate their estates. That dilemma pushed many of the greatest men into a coordinated revolt, not because they sought reform, but because they wanted the throne in different hands. Their methods were familiar. They activated their castles, fortified them, and began devastating the lands of opponents. A castle had to be fed, and the quickest way to feed it was to seize crops and livestock. Once that cycle began, violence could spread outward, turning local society into prey for competing strongholds. The king's response showed what effective monarchy looked like. He worked to split the rebels by promises and warnings. He appealed to the wider population with guarantees of better rule. He mobilised loyal churchmen to strengthen resistance, and most importantly, he fought personally, moving from siege to siege until strongholds fell one by one. Without rapid support from across the Channel, the rebels collapsed. In the aftermath, some fled and surrendered their lands. The lesson was clear. Dynastic rebellion could rise quickly, but it could also be crushed quickly by decisive force. A later rebellion, far larger in scale, shows the same underlying logic but with greater stakes. This time the rebellion formed around a king's son, not a brother, and around a son whose future inheritance had already been acknowledged. Yet the son was impatient, eager for real power rather than ceremonial status. He felt trapped, surrounded by knights, but lacking the resources to reward them. When his father sought to provide for a younger brother with lands and titles, the older son interpreted it as an insult and a threat. He fled to allies, and the rebellion spread like wildfire. Brothers joined him. Their mother supported them and was captured. Foreign rulers were drawn in with promises of territory. The plan was not merely to defeat the king, but to carve up his dominions, handing pieces to powerful supporters. War erupted across a vast map. Attacks came from multiple directions. Some invaders failed quickly, some rebel leaders were captured, mercenaries were slaughtered or imprisoned, towns were burned, castles changed hands. Yet the conflict dragged on, because the rebellion was not a single army, but a network of forces acting in different regions. Then the king returned in person, and events turned sharply. A major enemy ruler in the north was captured unexpectedly, and the rebellion began to unravel. strongholds surrendered, leaders submitted, mercenaries were expelled. The king crossed back into France and relieved his threatened capital with ease. Eventually the sons and their allies returned to their father's authority, at least outwardly, and a settlement was reached. The war left scars, but it also revealed the king's strengths: loyal officials who had risen through service, towns that remained faithful, a treasury capable of funding armies, and a ruler who could lead in the field. Yet the deeper problem remained unresolved. The family rivalry did not disappear. The hostility of foreign kings did not fade. The next generation would repeat the drama under new conditions, and when the king finally died, he died pursued by the combined pressure of his son and his greatest external rival. After rebellion came punishment, and here the monarchy faced a choice. A king could crush rebels completely, stripping lands and breaking dynasties to create fear and increase royal resources. Or he could reconcile, restoring men to power in exchange for submission. Both approaches had risks. Total destruction could frighten even loyal nobles, because it suggested that any great family might be uprooted. Reconciliation could look like weakness if done without control. In practice, English kings often combined both. They made examples of a few men who had to be broken, while forgiving others to rebuild stability. Across the 12th century, especially under the Angevin, complete dispossession became less common. Major rebels were frequently imprisoned and humbled, but many were later restored. The goal was not endless vengeance. The goal was a functioning political order in which yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's servant. That relative restraint stands out when compared with the later centuries, where defeated nobles were far more likely to be executed or mutilated. It also stands out when compared with parts of the British Isles, where harsher practices remained common in dynastic struggle. In England, the highborn did suffer imprisonment and ruin, and sometimes terrible deaths occurred, but large-scale post-war slaughter of aristocrats was not the usual pattern. Across medieval Europe, nobles using force to settle disputes was normal. England had a stronger tradition of royal control, but after 1066 the highest aristocrats were largely Norman in origin, and many still held lands across the Channel. That meant they carried two political instincts at once. They were subjects of the English crown, yet they also thought like Norman lords. And in Normandy, violent feuds were treated with looser rules than in England. A Norman chronicler even remarks that burning a neighbour's farms and waging private war would be considered a shocking crime in England, punished severely. The point is clear. What sounded outrageous on one side of the Channel could seem far less scandalous on the other. A powerful Anglo-Norman baron was unlikely to switch mentalities the moment he stepped onto a ship. Even writers who supported royal authority admitted that noble obligations could pull men into armed conflict. If a lord held different estates from different overlords, and those overlords fought each other, he was expected to follow the principal lord when called to war, even if that meant fighting against another lord he had once served. In other words, the feudal world accepted that violence could be legitimate and that layered loyalties could demand it. That same thinking could make resistance to a king feel less like treason and more like a grimly accepted option. One custom shows this clearly. Before turning to open revolt, rebels might publicly renounce their loyalty. By formally breaking the bond, they claimed they were no longer bound to obey and could therefore fight honourably rather than as traitors. The idea behind this was blunt. Obedience was not unbreakable. If a man believed he had a serious cause, he could declare that his lord was no longer his lord and then take up arms. We can see this in dramatic moments of the 12th century. A leading magnate who would later back a rival claimant to the throne sent word to the king that his allegiance was ended. Once the king had been openly rejected in this way, war could be waged without the rebel admitting guilt in his own mind. Around the same time, another great landholder faced a brutal dilemma when Scotland invaded northern England. Should he stand by the English king or by the Scottish ruler to whom he also owed obligations? On the eve of battle, he tried to negotiate but was accused of betrayal. At that point, he formally released himself from the homage he had given for his Scottish lands and returned to the English side. For him, that ritual separation mattered. It was a way of claiming that he was not a traitor, because he had first broken the tie in the accepted manner. When we reached the crisis of 1215, the rebel barons followed these same feudal rituals. They renounced loyalty before striking. But this rebellion also dressed itself in grander colours. It presented its cause as moral, even sacred, and spoke as if it fought for God and for the Church. This was new in English political conflict, a major rebellion describing itself not merely as a shift of loyalty toward a different prince, but as a justified struggle for a written programme. That programme did not come from nowhere. By this point, opposition to Angevin rule had been shaped by two forces. One was the traditional noble insistence on defending status, property and honour by any means necessary. The other was a sharper, more articulate critique coming from churchmen and educated clerks who watched royal government closely and who sometimes served the crown while attacking it with their pens. Some of these critics believed the kings had built a system that favoured low-born agents and aggressive officials, raised taxes heavily, manipulated justice, and weakened ancient rights. They complained that the crown delayed lawsuits when it suited the king, sold outcomes, and treated the great men of the realm as if they were obstacles to be managed rather than partners to be respected. At the same time, church critics accused the kings of crushing ecclesiastical independence, especially by controlling high church appointments. For them, a kingdom where bishops were made at a ruler's command looked like tyranny. The dispute that pushed these tensions into open crisis involved the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Competing claims over who had the right to choose the archbishop drew the conflict into the orbit of Rome. The Pope insisted on his authority and secured the appointment of Stephen Langton, a formidable scholar trained at the heart of Europe's intellectual world. From that moment, the king's opponents included not just angry barons, but an archbishop capable of giving their resistance structure and moral language. Then the king's position collapsed abroad. Failed campaigns and financial strain left him exposed. His enemies began circulating an old royal promise of good government from an earlier reign, using it as a foundation for their demands. By early 1215, a coalition formed around the idea that the realm needed binding limits on royal behaviour. Negotiations with the king went nowhere. The tone hardened. The opposition adopted the language of sacred duty, presenting themselves as defenders of liberty for both church and kingdom. In response, the king demanded renewed oaths of loyalty and even required people to swear support against the rebel document itself. That raised the stakes. It was no longer simply king versus rival prince, but king versus a written set of demands backed by force. The rebels gathered in arms, many coming from the north, and marched south as support grew. Talks continued, often mediated by Langton, but they produced no settlement. Everything changed when the rebels seized London in mid-May. The city's cooperation made the capture easier, and its loss was a decisive shock. With his main city gone, the king agreed to terms, even while planning to undo them later. What followed was the drafting and sealing of Magna Carta at Runnymede in June 1215. Part of the document aimed directly at dismantling the king's system of coercion, removing foreign mercenaries, restoring hostages, and addressing the enormous financial burdens that had been used to keep nobles under pressure. But the charter went far beyond a temporary peace deal. It was written as a grant meant to stand, setting out procedures and limits that the king promised to follow. Much of it dealt with feudal power, inheritance, guardianship of minors, forced marriages, and the treatment of widows and heiresses. It also addressed the hated reach of royal forest law, which placed large tracts under special rules and penalties. And in a clause with huge long-term consequences, the charter insisted that certain taxes could not be levied without broad consent. The charter placed the law of the land in direct opposition to the king's personal will. Yet the rebels did not want weaker royal justice. They wanted a justice system that functioned consistently and fairly. Royal courts had become the main place to resolve disputes. That change could not be reversed, and nobody truly wanted it reversed. What they demanded was that the system obey its own rules. No arbitrary imprisonment, no ruin by mere command, no justice bought or delayed for profit. The most famous line to express this ideal: free men should not be crushed without lawful judgment, and justice should not be sold or postponed. In 1215, however, the most explosive feature was the enforcement mechanism. A council of 25 barons was created to oversee compliance. If the king violated the charter and refused to correct the breach, this group was permitted to compel him by seizing his property and strongholds. In medieval terms, it was a familiar technique used by superiors against inferiors. Here it was turned against the monarch. The plan even included a general oath binding the wider community to support the 25 when they acted. No medieval king could accept such an arrangement as permanent without surrendering real power. The king therefore moved quickly to destroy the agreement. He sought support from the Pope, who sided with him, annulled the charter, and punished Langton for refusing to condemn the rebels. Attempts at negotiation broke down, and war resumed. The conflict began as a fight over the charter, because rebels who submitted were made to renounce it explicitly. But it soon turned into a dynastic struggle. The rebels invited the French heir to take the English throne. He landed in 1216, entered London, and was greeted as a liberator by many. The Scottish king moved into the north. John's supporters began switching sides. The old Angevin Capetian rivalry that had been fought for years in France now spilled fully onto English soil. Then John died. His death changed everything. Many who could never accept him could tolerate loyalty to a child king. The new boy ruler was crowned at once, and almost immediately a revised version of the charter was issued in his name. The most radical enforcement provisions were removed, but much of the text remained. Crucially, the royalist leadership embraced the charter's broader message and used it to draw rebels back into the fold. In 1217, after the French claimant was defeated and withdrew, the charter was issued again, showing that military victory and constitutional concession could exist together. This is why 1215 matters so deeply. It was the first English rebellion that openly pursued a complex written reform programme and attempted to bind the monarchy to it. Personal hatred and private grievances were certainly present, and some leaders had long wanted the king destroyed. But the revolt also carried a blueprint for how the kingdom should be governed. Later generations of rebels would look back to Magna Carta as a model when they drafted their own demands. People sometimes talk as if medieval England was sealed off by the sea, but it never was. England covered only part of Britain, and it had real land frontiers to the west and the north. Those borderlands lived by different rhythms than the safer heartlands. They offered chances for expansion, trade and influence, but they also bred insecurity. Raids, feuds, and sudden violence were part of the landscape, and outsiders often described these edges of the realm as unruly places where royal commands were obeyed only when convenient. Living near the border meant living with danger so close that landowners deliberately settled fighting men on their estates simply because they needed brave men at hand. England was the wealthiest and in many ways the strongest power in the British Isles, but it was not alone. Wales had its own princes, Scotland had its own kings. Beyond them were other semi-independent regions and sea-linked lordships. Any English claim to superiority had to be enforced, negotiated, or purchased, because neighbouring rulers were not inclined to accept English dominance simply out of respect. This was not a world of a single island kingdom. It was a crowded political arena filled with competing dynasties, shifting alliances, and overlapping claims. Along the western frontier, Welsh politics were intensely fragmented. Several principalities struggled against one another, and at the same time fought the English or made deals with them. After the Norman takeover of England, securing that frontier became urgent. The solution was to create powerful border lordships, led by earls with unusually wide freedom to act. They were expected to defend the realm, but they quickly turned defence into conquest. Castles became the key tool, just as they had been in England. Fortified bases that protected garrisons, anchored settlements, and allowed steady pressure into Welsh territory. Before long, river valleys and coastal plains were studded with new strongholds, and military power began to reshape the map. The evidence of the time shows how brutal the border zone could be. Settlements were abandoned, farmland lay unused, and whole stretches of countryside were described as ruined or waste, sometimes from Welsh attacks, sometimes from Norman punishment, and sometimes because building a castle meant clearing people out. In places, a fortress might literally replace dozens of homes. Population was thin, the land was anxious, and survival could look like living off hunting and whatever could be taken from a hard landscape. On some frontier estates, even basic administration seemed suspended, as if those districts sat in a grey zone between law and wilderness. Control over Wales was never uniform. In some areas, Norman lords implanted followers, imposed direct rule, and organised surrounding territory around castles. In others, the new rulers relied on tribute and local intermediaries. Welsh customs often remained in place, and Welsh officials continued to collect rents and dues, sometimes paid in livestock or produce rather than coin. This mix created a patchwork. Some districts were tightly held and colonised, while others were only loosely dominated, paying money or goods when forced, and resisting when opportunity appeared. In the decades after the conquest, opportunities for expansion seemed immense. Norman forces pushed deep into Wales from several directions. They built more castles, seized lowlands, and tried to convert claims on paper into power on the ground. Some advances succeeded quickly, others ended in disaster. Commanders could be killed, garrisons wiped out, and gains reversed almost overnight. In the north, attempts to control key coastal regions met fierce resistance, and even when the invaders struck hard, Welsh counterattacks could undo years of effort. By around 1100, the basic long-term pattern had taken shape. Large stretches of eastern and southern Wales were dominated by marcher lordships, while much of the north and central interior remained under Welsh rulers. Wales had always been politically divided, and now that division became even more complex because native principalities existed alongside intrusive lordships that behaved like miniature states. Warfare was constant, but it was not simply Welsh versus Norman. Welsh fought Welsh. Norman lords fought other Norman lords. Alliances shifted fast, betrayals were normal, and fortunes rose and fell with startling speed. English kings sometimes intervened directly, especially when a strong ruler sat on the throne in England. A determined king could break great marcher families, reshuffle lordships, and use marriage and patronage to create new power blocks along the frontier. Royal policy could also include building major royal castles, and in some areas, turning frontier territory into something more like an English province, with officials answerable to the crown. Another method was settlement, bringing in immigrant communities who would depend on the new order and therefore defend it fiercely. At the same time, the crown exploited rivalries among Welsh princes, keeping them divided so none could dominate too completely. When pressure and diplomacy were not enough, large royal expeditions marched into Wales to demand submission. Yet royal control in Wales was fragile. When a strong king died and the English throne weakened, Welsh resurgence followed. Castles fell, conquered districts were reclaimed, and border lords were forced onto the defensive. During periods of English civil conflict, Welsh leaders gained space to expand, and alliances with Welsh rulers became useful to English factions. Out of this turbulent era emerged powerful native princes who crushed internal rivals, conquered neighbours, and pushed back the marcher lords. Even when firm royal government returned in England, these Welsh rulers could still remain more independent than earlier generations had managed. English campaigns might punish and intimidate, but terrain, supply problems, and relentless harassment could turn invasions into humiliations. Over time, a more flexible arrangement often replaced outright conquest. Welsh rulers were recognised as subordinate partners, allowed to keep or even enlarge their territories in return for cooperation. That cooperation could matter in English civil wars, when Welsh forces might fight on the king's side against rebellious English magnates. Inside the Marcher lordships themselves, another split developed. Lowland districts often became heavily settled, organised around castles and towns and shaped by feudal landholding. Upland areas, by contrast, frequently remained under Welsh local rulers who acknowledged an overlord in theory but kept real autonomy. This created two worlds within the same lordship, an anglicised zone near the coast or main routes, and a Welsh-controlled interior that could still strike back. Frontier dominance was never absolute, and dramatic reversals were always possible, including daring attacks on the very heart of a lord's power. Welsh political life also followed different inheritance customs than the Marcher world. In many Marcher families, succession rules helped keep lordships intact across generations. In the Welsh principalities, broader claims among sons created chronic internal conflict. Feuds between brothers, cousins, and uncles were not occasional accidents, they were built into the political structure. Only a leader of exceptional skill could rise above that violence and turn a principality into a dominant power. When such a figure appeared in the north, he built a compact but formidable state, expanded during England's civil strife, seized key strongholds, and then converted many of those gains into recognised authority through negotiation. By the early 13th century, that northern power looked like a serious threat to the Marcher lords on Wales's southern and eastern edges. The northern frontier with Scotland worked differently. The border there was not the same kind of cultural fault line found on the Welsh edge. In much of the eastern border region, communities on both sides shared similar language, social habits, and economic life. For long stretches, the frontier divided lands that had once belonged to the same earlier political world. The sharper divide in Scotland was not between Scotland and England in the modern sense, but between Gaelic-speaking regions and the areas closer to the eastern lowlands where speech and culture resembled northern England. Religious ties also crossed the border easily, with saints revered in both realms and monasteries holding property on either side. Even later wars did not immediately erase these connections. Cross-border church networks and landholding persisted for centuries. Despite that cultural overlap, kings still went to war. Large invasions were not constant, but they did flare up in distinct moments, usually when England was weakened by internal crisis. In those windows, Scottish kings could raid deep into northern England, seize key towns, or press old territorial claims. English kings responded with invasions and devastation in return. Yet if we look across the long span from the late 11th century into the early 13th, major cross-border campaigns were surprisingly rare. Most years saw no royal army crossing the line at all. Compared with other European frontiers, the Anglo-Scottish border in this era was often calmer than later centuries would be. One reason was the changing character of the Scottish monarchy. Marriage connections and upbringing produced kings who were deeply familiar with English politics, and in some cases held major estates in England as great lords. That meant the Scottish royal family was not an isolated northern dynasty. It was tied into the Anglo-Norman world by land, marriage, patronage, and personal experience at the English court. Scottish kings used this advantage to recruit and settle Anglo-Norman nobles in Scotland, granting them lands and offices and creating a new aristocratic layer with French ancestry, feudal obligations and cross-border property. Over time, a network of families emerged whose interests straddled the frontier, reinforcing cultural and political linkage even when kings quarrelled. But two issues kept tension alive. One was territory, especially the great northern counties and the western region around Carlisle, which shifted hands during periods of English weakness and was later pulled back by stronger English rulers. The other was status. Medieval politics was obsessed with hierarchy, and homage between kings raised dangerous questions. A king could be another king's vassal for a specific set of lands, but no ruler wanted that act to imply that his entire kingdom was held from someone else. As feudal ideas hardened, the question became unavoidable. When a Scottish king performed homage to the English king, was it for his English estates or for the kingship of Scotland itself? English kings often pushed one interpretation, Scottish kings insisted on the other. That ambiguity sat like dry tinder, ready to ignite whenever the balance of power shifted. Scottish kings in the 11th and 12th centuries often ended up acknowledging English power through formal acts of loyalty. Malcolm Canmore and the rulers who followed him sometimes submitted because they had no choice, and sometimes because they needed English backing in a dangerous political moment. Once the Scottish royal family held major lands inside England, especially the great earldom based around Huntingdon, this kind of submission became hard to avoid. Holding English territory meant accepting English rules, and that usually meant doing homage. After David came to the Scottish throne, the situation became even clearer. If the Scottish king personally accepted English earldoms, he would be expected to kneel and swear loyalty like any other English tenant. David had reasons to resist that humiliation, so when opportunities arose to receive major earldoms, he sometimes preferred that they be granted to his son instead. In practice, this allowed the Scottish dynasty to keep the benefits of English land and titles, while limiting how far the King of Scots had to bow to the King of England. A major turning point came in the middle of the 12th century, when a strong English king imposed a harsh settlement on Scotland. As part of that deal, the Scottish king performed homage, and the arrangement was wrapped in language that could be interpreted in different ways. From the Scottish perspective, it could be presented as a duty owed for English lands rather than a confession that Scotland itself was held from England. These careful distinctions mattered because medieval politics was obsessed with rank. A king could accept that he owed obligations for a specific territory, but he could not easily accept that his entire kingdom was treated as another man's fief. Then came disaster for Scotland. When the Scottish king was captured during an English campaign, the English crown pressed its advantage further than ever before. The new terms were designed to make English dominance unmistakable. The Scottish king was declared the English king's loyal man not only for his English estates but for Scotland itself, and he swore deep personal loyalty in a way that publicly reduced the status of his kingship. The settlement reached beyond the king alone. Scottish bishops and abbots were required to recognise English authority in broad terms, and the leading nobles were also brought under the same oath-bound framework. As a guarantee, key Scottish castles were handed over to English control, and hostages were demanded from the highest level of the royal family and nobility. For a time, Scotland's independence was constrained not only by ceremony and promises, but by garrisons and prisoners. That grip loosened when the English throne passed to a ruler who needed vast sums for a crusade and was willing to trade power for money. In a carefully staged agreement, the English king returned the castles and released the forced obligations that had been extracted in captivity. The wording of the New Deal was deliberately vague, allowing each side to claim it had protected its dignity. Beneath the formal language, however, a huge payment helped make the settlement possible. Scotland recovered room to manoeuvre, but the underlying quarrel did not vanish. The Scottish royal house never truly gave up its ambition to regain the northern English lands it had once held, especially Northumberland. Repeated efforts failed, and pressure from England sometimes forced Scotland into costly, humiliating bargains involving enormous payments and marriage pledges. Later, when England collapsed into civil war, Scotland saw its chance again. Scottish forces moved into northern England, accepted the loyalty of local rebels, and even marched far south in pursuit of a broader alliance. Yet once the English crown regained control, Scotland was compelled to make peace, return captured territory, and restore the frontier to its earlier line. After that, relations between the two kingdoms entered a quieter phase, shaped more by negotiation and shared aristocratic ties than by constant invasion. Across the Irish Sea, the story took a different direction. Ireland was not connected by a land frontier, but the sea lanes tied it closely to Western Britain. Trade, raiding, and religious contact had linked the two worlds for centuries. By the 12th century, Ireland became something new in English political thinking, a target for conquest and settlement. That shift began with a power struggle inside Ireland itself. A defeated Irish king, driven from his position by rivals, crossed to the ports of Western England, and then sought the consent of the English king to recruit soldiers among the English king's followers. This approach was not unprecedented. Norman warriors had been serving rulers across Britain for generations, and frontier lords from the Welsh March were especially suited to the kind of warfare Ireland demanded. They came from a world of castles, raids, and fragmented politics, and they knew how to seize ground quickly and hold it behind timber and earth. The exiled Irish ruler managed to attract experienced leaders from that border society, and he cemented his most important alliance by promising marriage and inheritance to a powerful marcher lord whose ambitions had been blocked at home. What followed was a rapid and decisive intervention. Small forces landed first, then more arrived, including heavily armed cavalry and large numbers of archers. With their help, the Irish claimant regained his position and struck outward. Key coastal towns fell, including the great port cities whose wealth and strategic value mattered as much as their walls. But the original sponsor died soon after, and the foreign commanders faced a choice: go home, serve another Irish king, or carve out a realm of their own. They chose to stay and build a new lordship, creating a political structure that stretched across the sea, linking Welsh and English bases to Irish strongholds. That prospect alarmed the English crown. The English king had no intention of letting one of his magnates become a near king in Ireland. He moved quickly, restricting trade, threatening punishment, taking lands back in England, and preparing a royal expedition. When the king arrived, he forced the newcomers to submit, reclaimed important towns for royal control, and reshaped the settlement. Some territories were granted to trusted royal men to balance powerful lords, while many native Irish rulers were left in place beyond the main zones of conquest, provided they acknowledged English overlordship and offered tribute or hostages. The result was a dual system. A new Anglo-Irish aristocracy would rule large carved-out lordships secured by castles, while outside those zones many Irish dynasties continued to govern under a formal shadow of English authority. In the decades that followed, English rule in Ireland expanded through both government and settlement. English-style administration grew, counties took shape, royal officials appeared, and courts and financial offices were built on English models. Yet the real engine of conquest was the immigrant nobility. Great lords granted out lands in exchange for knight service, dividing territory into feudal units and displacing earlier rulers. Charters made the logic stark. Land that had once belonged to named Irish families was now handed to newcomers in return for military service, to be held freely and inherited. Not everyone who gained land was an early adventurer. Over time, royal administrators and their networks also became major beneficiaries, receiving Irish estates as rewards for service. Some conquests were launched almost as private campaigns by restless commanders who seized territory, built castles, founded monasteries, and ruled for decades until political rivals, backed by the crown, replaced them. Royal plans for Ireland shifted repeatedly. At one moment, the English king tried to govern through a single, dominant Irish ruler who would act as a subordinate king over the unconquered areas, paying tribute while keeping order. But Ireland's native politics did not bend easily to such tidy designs, and the settlers were not satisfied with narrow limits either. the Crown experimented with grand schemes, including attempts to create a distinct Irish kingship for a younger royal son. But early efforts ended in failure, mishandled diplomacy, and alienation of local rulers. In the end, Ireland became permanently bound to the English crown not by a single clean decision, but by the accidents of dynastic succession and the crown's determination to prevent any magnate from becoming too powerful. Later English kings treated Ireland as a personal lordship, intervening directly when necessary. A major royal expedition in the early 13th century showed where the crown's priorities lay: less a total conquest of the Irish kings, more a tightening of control over the Anglo-Irish barons, whose rivalries and semi-independent power could threaten royal authority. Castles were besieged, great lordships were seized into royal hands, submissions were demanded, and declarations were issued insisting that English law would guide the lordship. Taken together, Wales, Scotland and Ireland reveal a wider pattern. Norman and Angevin rulers did not usually seek to erase local kings and princes across the British Isles. Instead, they aimed for overlordship, visible recognition of English superiority through homage, hostages, military cooperation, and occasional garrisons, while leaving much day-to-day rule to subordinate powers. Only in a few royal strongholds did the English crown rule directly. The preferred model was dominance without total replacement. The church followed a parallel path. English church leaders, especially those linked to the leading archbishopric in southern England, claimed spiritual authority far beyond England's borders. In some places, like parts of Ireland's coastal towns, bishops were consecrated under English supervision and swore obedience to English archbishops, strengthening the sense that the English Church held primacy across the wider archipelago. Letters and reforms carried a moral edge, criticising Irish practices while pressing for closer alignment with English norms. In Wales, ecclesiastical subordination tended to arrive behind armies and castles. As conquest advanced, new bishops were appointed in conquered zones, often outsiders backed by military power. Resistance could be fierce, and some bishops found the frontier so hostile that they fled. Yet as Anglo-Norman influence deepened, obedience to English archbishops became routine, especially in dioceses located near major marcher strongholds, where political reality left little room for defiance. Over time, many Welsh bishoprics were led by men trained in English institutions or connected to marcher dynasties, and only occasionally by figures drawn wholly from native Welsh society. Scotland was more complicated. The English Church was not represented there by a single uncontested authority, because rival English archbishoprics competed for influence. Northern English church leaders claimed oversight of Scottish dioceses, and some Scottish bishops accepted that relationship, at least formally. Others resisted for years, contesting the idea that any English churchman could stand above them. Even when consecrations were performed by English archbishops, Scottish bishops sometimes made it clear they were reserving their own rights. Here, as in politics, ceremony and wording mattered, because the line between cooperation and subordination was always being argued over. One of the main weaknesses of the Scottish Church in its struggle with English claims was the simple fact that it had no archbishop of its own. The Bishop of St Andrews was often described as the leading churchman of the Scots, which hints at the importance of that see, but its authority was never clearly defined in a way that church lawyers of the 12th century would recognise. Several efforts were made, with royal backing, to elevate St Andrews to full archiepiscopal status, yet all of them failed. Even so, the Scottish bishops worked hard to defend their independence. This resistance became visible when pressure was applied openly. At a major council held in England, the English king demanded that the Scottish clergy submit to the English Church in the same way he claimed they had done in earlier generations. The Scottish bishops answered firmly that no such submission had ever taken place, and that they had no intention of beginning now. Matters became even more complicated when the Archbishop of York put forward his own claim, only to see it challenged by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who insisted that Scotland should answer to him instead. Faced with competing English demands and determined Scottish resistance, the king eventually allowed the Scottish bishops to leave. They immediately appealed to the Pope for protection. At first, the papacy had often supported English claims. For decades, letters were sent urging Scottish bishops to obey the Archbishop of York. But attitudes in Rome began to shift. In the later 12th century, the Pope became more receptive to the idea that the Scottish Church should not be subject to any English archbishop at all. This change may have been influenced by wider tensions between the papacy and the English crown at the time. The turning point came with a papal declaration that stated clearly that the Scottish Church was directly subject to the Pope himself and to no intermediate authority. From that moment onward, Scotland occupied a unique position in Western Christendom. It had no archbishop and answered only to Rome. English observers reacted with bitterness, seeing this as an example of papal power overturning established hierarchies. Yet the result endured. The Scottish Church secured its autonomy in a way that neither Wales nor Ireland ever fully achieved. Ireland followed a different path. The Irish Church asserted its independence earlier and more decisively. Although some Irish bishops had once been consecrated under English influence, major church assemblies reorganised Ireland into a fully independent structure with several archbishoprics and a clear hierarchy of bishops beneath them. This system gained papal approval and deliberately excluded English oversight. Crucially, this success was driven by Irish church reformers who had strong connections to Rome and shared its vision of ecclesiastical order. Through their efforts, Ireland entered the period of English political domination with a church that was already constitutionally independent. As English settlers and clergy later filled many church offices in conquered regions of Ireland, the structure itself remained separate. There was never a serious attempt to impose English ecclesiastical supremacy over the whole island, as had happened in Wales. In Wales, the struggle was longer and more bitter. Some Welsh bishops attempted, late and unsuccessfully, to resist Canterbury's authority. Ironically, these efforts were led not by native Welshmen but by churchmen of Anglo-Norman or French background. Their loyalty to their diocese outweighed any sense of national identity. One bishop in particular sought to raise his see to archiepiscopal status, arguing that the Welsh Church had ancient rights, that Wales was distinct from England, and that Canterbury's authority rested on conquest rather than tradition. The dispute reached the papal court, where both sides argued fiercely. A compromise was imposed. Personal obedience was required, while the larger question was postponed. When the Welsh bishop died, Canterbury ensured the appointment of a compliant successor. Decades later, the issue flared up again when a talented and embittered cleric launched a final campaign for Welsh ecclesiastical independence. He argued that Wales had its own language, laws, customs, and ancient Christian heritage, and that English control had been imposed by force. Yet power lay elsewhere. English kings and archbishops were united in their determination to prevent a separate Welsh church, fearing that ecclesiastical independence would encourage political rebellion. In the end, the challenger was branded a political threat and forced to abandon his claims. Welsh dioceses remained under Canterbury for centuries. These ecclesiastical struggles cannot be separated from secular politics. Scottish kings supported church independence because it protected royal autonomy. In Wales, military conquest made ecclesiastical subordination almost unavoidable. In Ireland, papal reform prevented English church dominance even after English political control was established. Church structures evolved alongside conquest and colonisation, but they did not always follow the same logic or timetable. Alongside political and ecclesiastical change came deep social transformation. The expansion of English power brought migration, settlement, and new institutions. Castles, feudal lordship, and planned towns spread across Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Many new towns were modelled directly on English examples, both in law and population. Urban settlers were often English or continental Europeans, and these towns became islands of English language and custom surrounded by native societies. Rural settlement followed the same pattern in many regions. Place names and personal names reveal widespread English-speaking communities in parts of Ireland and Wales. Over time, this movement dramatically expanded the reach of the English language. Even at a very local level, field names and village records reflect an English-speaking world implanted into new landscapes. The overall result was uneven. Wales and Ireland became divided into heavily anglicised zones, and areas where native society remained dominant. These lands stayed more militarised than England itself. Castles mattered more, warfare remained constant, and feudal obligations retained their military edge rather than becoming purely financial. Native societies adopted some new practices, but only in Scotland did we see a broad and deliberate integration of English institutions under native royal control. There, the result was a strong and lasting kingdom that remained politically independent while becoming culturally anglicised, especially in the lowlands. English attitudes toward their neighbours reflected these changes. Educated writers increasingly portrayed the peoples of Wales, Scotland and Ireland as backward and uncivilised. They emphasised pastoral economies, weak urban life, political fragmentation, and what they saw as moral and religious failings. These societies were labelled barbarous, not because they lacked resources, but because they were thought to lack discipline, order, and refinement. Such judgments often blended cultural criticism with religious condemnation. Differences in worship and church practice were treated as evidence of inferiority. Reforming rulers of foreign descent were praised for erasing these supposed flaws, while native traditions were dismissed. Nowhere is this clearer than in English praise for the Scottish royal dynasty, which was applauded for adopting English and continental customs. Over time, Scottish kings married into Anglo-Norman families, spoke foreign languages, dressed like French nobles, and ruled through imported institutions. English observers concluded that Scotland had entered the civilised world only by ceasing to be truly Scottish. As English settlers and clergy later filled many church offices in conquered regions of Ireland, the structure itself remained separate. There was never a serious attempt to impose English ecclesiastical supremacy over the whole island, as had happened in Wales. In Wales, the struggle was longer and more bitter. Some Welsh bishops attempted, late and unsuccessfully, to resist Canterbury's authority. Ironically, these efforts were led not by native Welshmen but by churchmen of Anglo-Norman or French background. Their loyalty to their diocese outweighed any sense of national identity. One bishop in particular sought to raise his see to archiepiscopal status, arguing that the Welsh Church had ancient rights, that Wales was distinct from England, and that Canterbury's authority rested on conquest rather than tradition. The dispute reached the papal court, where both sides argued fiercely. A compromise was imposed. Personal obedience was required, while the larger question was postponed. When the Welsh bishop died, Canterbury ensured the appointment of a compliant successor. Decades later, the issue flared up again when a talented and embittered cleric launched a final campaign for Welsh ecclesiastical independence. He argued that Wales had its own language, laws, customs, and ancient Christian heritage, and that English control had been imposed by force. Yet power lay elsewhere. English kings and archbishops were united in their determination to prevent a separate Welsh church, fearing that ecclesiastical independence would encourage political rebellion. In the end, the challenger was branded a political threat and forced to abandon his claims. Welsh dioceses remained under Canterbury for centuries. These ecclesiastical struggles cannot be separated from secular politics. Scottish kings supported church independence because it protected royal autonomy. In Wales, military conquest made ecclesiastical subordination almost unavoidable. In Ireland, papal reform prevented English church dominance even after English political control was established. Church structures evolved alongside conquest and colonisation, but they did not always follow the same logic or timetable. Alongside political and ecclesiastical change came deep social transformation. The expansion of English power brought migration, settlement, and new institutions. Castles, feudal lordship, and planned towns spread across Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Many new towns were modelled directly on English examples, both in law and population. Urban settlers were often English or continental Europeans, and these towns became islands of English language and custom surrounded by native societies. Rural settlement followed the same pattern in many regions. Place names and personal names reveal widespread English-speaking communities in parts of Ireland and Wales. Over time, this movement dramatically expanded the reach of the English language. Even at a very local level, field names and village records reflect an English-speaking world implanted into new landscapes. The overall result was uneven. Wales and Ireland became divided into heavily anglicised zones, and areas where native society remained dominant. These lands stayed more militarised than England itself. Castles mattered more, warfare remained constant, and feudal obligations retained their military edge rather than becoming purely financial. Native societies adopted some new practices, but only in Scotland did we see a broad and deliberate integration of English institutions under native royal control. There, the result was a strong and lasting kingdom that remained politically independent while becoming culturally anglicised, especially in the lowlands. English attitudes toward their neighbours reflected these changes. Educated writers increasingly portrayed the peoples of Wales, Scotland and Ireland as backward and uncivilised. They emphasised pastoral economies, weak urban life, political fragmentation, and what they saw as moral and religious failings. These societies were labelled barbarous, not because they lacked resources, but because they were thought to lack discipline, order, and refinement. Such judgments often blended cultural criticism with religious condemnation. Differences in worship and church practice were treated as evidence of inferiority. Reforming rulers of foreign descent were praised for erasing these supposed flaws, while native traditions were dismissed. Nowhere is this clearer than in English praise for the Scottish royal dynasty, which was applauded for adopting English and continental customs. Over time, Scottish kings married into Anglo-Norman families, spoke foreign languages, dressed like French nobles, and ruled through imported institutions. English observers concluded that Scotland had entered the civilised world only by ceasing to be truly Scottish. This mindset extended far beyond the British Isles. English writers described Ireland and Scotland as lands redeemed by conquest, feudal order, and foreign rule. They believed that English domination replaced chaos with structure, irreligion with piety, and pastoral simplicity with proper government. These ideas formed a powerful myth of civilising conquest that would echo through later centuries. At the same time, England's horizon was widening. Political, commercial, and religious ties linked the kingdom not only to France and the British Isles, but to the wider European and Mediterranean world. Pilgrimage, trade, diplomacy, marriage alliances, and crusading drew England into a dense web of international contact. The Church acted as a bridge, carrying people and ideas across borders. England's orientation shifted southward. Scandinavia, once central to English politics, faded into the background as ties with France, Flanders, and the German lands grew stronger. Trade networks deepened, especially around wool and cloth. German merchants replaced Scandinavian traders in London, and powerful alliances linked English kings to major continental dynasties. One of the most significant of these was an alliance with a leading German ruling family. Marriage bound the two houses together, leading to decades of shared exile, diplomacy, and political coordination. Members of this dynasty spent long periods at the English court, raised children there, and relied on English support in their struggles at home. At its height, this alliance shaped the balance of power across Western Europe, until it collapsed in a decisive battle that reshaped the political map. Beyond Northern Europe lay the Mediterranean world, still seen as ancient, wealthy, and wondrous. English writers spoke with awe of its cities, relics, and imperial traditions. Contact intensified through crusades, commerce, and diplomacy. English merchants settled in Italian ports, scholars travelled south, and English clerics rose to high office in Mediterranean kingdoms. Royal marriages reinforced these ties. Constantinople stood at the edge of English imagination, vast and rich beyond comparison. English travellers described its walls, its crowds, its relics, and its treasure. Diplomatic exchanges linked English kings with Byzantine emperors, and relics flowed westward as gifts. Yet admiration mixed with suspicion. Cultural and religious divisions between Latin and Greek Christianity deepened, and crusading only worsened mutual hostility. By the end of the 12th century, English attitudes toward the Eastern Empire were openly hostile. Greek society was portrayed as weak and deceitful, and conflict replaced cooperation. Campaigns in the Eastern Mediterranean brought plunder on a massive scale, much of it ending up in English churches and monasteries. Sacred objects taken from the East became symbols of victory, wealth, and divine favour. The period we are looking at overlaps with the first great age of crusading. In the late 11th century, a call was made for a vast armed pilgrimage toward the Eastern Mediterranean. Within a year, enormous groups of warriors, pilgrims, and followers began moving east from Western Europe. Most of these expeditions suffered terribly from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Some collapsed entirely. Yet in the summer of 1099, a reduced but determined force stormed Jerusalem in a brutal assault and placed the city under Christian control for the first time in centuries. Shortly afterward, a new Latin kingdom was established there, while other crusader states appeared along the coast and deep into the interior. People connected to England took part from the beginning. Some were of English background, but many more were Normans who held land and power in England. English sailors also played a role, operating in eastern waters and capturing key ports. Noble families with English connections appeared repeatedly in the early crusading leadership. Even members of the old royal House of England joined later expeditions, showing that involvement in crusading cut across political and dynastic change. England's contribution in the early Crusades was limited in numbers but distinctive in character. English fleets became especially important. In both the First and Second Crusades, ships from English ports transported fighters and launched attacks along Muslim-held coastlines. One of the most dramatic successes came in the mid-12th century, when a large fleet made up of English, Norman, and other Western sailors sailed south and helped seize a major Iberian port after a long siege. That victory became one of the defining moments of the wider crusading effort of that year. An English churchman was appointed as bishop of the newly restored city, and he later returned home to urge further participation in holy war. Notably, the First Crusade was led not by kings but by great lords. That changed in later expeditions, when rulers of major kingdoms took the lead. Even so, kings of England did not personally join at first. This was not due to indifference. Civil war and political instability made absence from the kingdom risky. Royal families in England were closely linked by blood to the rulers of Jerusalem, and these family ties remained strong across generations. For decades, the rulers of England were uncles, cousins, or close relatives of the kings ruling in the Holy Land. Because of these connections, expectations were high. When the Kingdom of Jerusalem entered a crisis late in the 12th century, envoys were sent across Europe seeking help, and England was an obvious destination. The English king was seen as one of the principal leaders of Western Christendom, with a special responsibility toward the Holy Land. Promises were made, crosses were taken, and funds were sent. Yet only one English king of this period actually reached the battlefield in the East. Alongside the Crusades themselves, new institutions emerged that blended religious devotion with military violence. The most famous of these were the military orders. These were communities of men who lived under strict discipline like monks but fought as professional warriors. The earliest of them was founded in Jerusalem to protect pilgrims. Its message spread rapidly across Europe, and it received enthusiastic support from nobles, clergy, and rulers. England became one of the major bases of support for these orders, Kings, queens, great lords, royal officials, and even minor landholders donated estates, rents, and privileges. Over time, properties belonging to these orders appeared across most of the country. Some of them left permanent marks on the landscape and on place names, especially in and around London, where the order established its main headquarters. The presence of these warrior monks served as a constant reminder that Jerusalem remained unfinished business. The crusade that most deeply involved England was the Third Crusade. This campaign followed the catastrophic loss of Jerusalem to a powerful Muslim ruler. After a crushing defeat, nearly all Christian-held cities in the region fell, except for a single coastal stronghold. In response, armies from across Western Europe mobilised once again, and the immediate goal became the capture of a vital port that was under siege. That siege lasted almost 2 years and drew participants from across the Christian world. Fighters arrived from northern and southern Europe alike. Chroniclers followed the struggle closely, describing starvation, disease, relentless attacks, and fierce resistance. English leaders were present even before their king arrived, and several prominent figures died during the campaign. Administrative skills were as important as military ones, and efforts were made to organise aid for poorer soldiers trapped in the siege. When the English king finally arrived, events moved quickly. Political tensions with allies continued, and unexpected conflicts diverted attention along the way. One such diversion led to the rapid conquest of an island in the eastern Mediterranean, which became a valuable strategic base. Only after this episode did the king reach the main battlefield. The final assault on the besieged city was intense and destructive. Siege engines hurled massive stones day and night. Defenders responded with fire and counterattacks. Tunnels were dug beneath the walls, and violent clashes erupted repeatedly. Eventually, the defenders surrendered under negotiated terms. Within weeks, one major ally departed for home, leaving the English king as the dominant commander in the region. Over the next year, he led campaigns along the coast, won major battles, and secured a narrow strip of territory that became the new core of the Christian kingdom. Twice he advanced toward Jerusalem itself, but each time he concluded that holding the city would be impossible. After 16 months, he departed without capturing the holy city, leaving behind a fragile but surviving Christian presence. Crusading was understood as a form of holy war. Even when military operations ended in greed or brutality, they were framed as sacred acts. Armies were accompanied by priests, rituals were enforced, and morale was sustained by stories of miracles and divine signs. Violence, when directed against the approved enemy, was presented as righteous. For a warrior aristocracy accustomed to conflict, crusade offered a way to transform sinful violence into holy action. For some, crusade also served as escape. Men who had fallen from favour or lost their land sometimes chose to leave on crusade, seeking redemption or simply distance from political failure. In several families, crusading became a repeated pattern across generations, with fathers, sons, and heirs all drawn to the Eastern Wars. Despite moments of success, no crusade after the first was a complete triumph. Failures were explained through moral reasoning. Defeat was blamed on pride, greed, and moral corruption within the armies. Restrictions were repeatedly imposed to enforce discipline and purity. Doubts did exist. A few thinkers questioned whether killing non-believers could ever be justified. But these voices were rare and often drowned out by louder defences of holy war, which argued that obedience to the church transformed violence into virtue. By the late 12th century, crusading had become deeply embedded in English life. Money, land, and resources flowed toward the cause. Heavy taxation financed expeditions, and individuals at every social level found ways to participate. Crusading armies themselves became international spaces, bringing together people from across Europe in pursuit of a shared goal. This had a lasting effect on how the English viewed the world. The Eastern Mediterranean came to occupy an outsized place in their mental map. Distant cities in Syria or Palestine seemed more important than closer regions in Europe. Rulers in the Holy Land were named alongside kings of England and France, while nearer powers were sometimes ignored. The Crusades reshaped not only politics and warfare, but also imagination and identity. At the same time, power at home rested on a complex system of lordship. Society was built on unequal personal bonds between lords and dependents. These relationships mixed what we would now separate as private property and public authority. Great lords controlled land, justice, armed force, and administration in ways that closely resembled royal power. Kings themselves operated within this system. They were lords among lords, but also something more. They shared many rights with their barons, such as the ability to demand payments on family occasions, yet they also possessed unique authority. They were anointed, sworn to protect the church, responsible for justice, guardians of the realm's peace, and surrounded by powerful symbols of rule. Kingship was expressed through ritual. Coronation did not merely celebrate power, it created it. Until crowned, a ruler was not fully king. The period between a king's death and the next coronation was dangerous and uncertain. Swift coronations could secure stability, while delays created tension. In England, unlike in some other kingdoms, heirs were usually not crowned during their father's lifetime, which made succession more fragile. The coronation itself was elaborate and deeply symbolic. The future king swore oaths to uphold peace and justice. He was anointed with sacred oil, marking him as chosen by God in a way no other layman was. He was armed with a sword to defend the weak and crowned as ruler. Prayers invoked the great leaders of the past and asked for victory over enemies. The ceremony presented the king as judge, warrior, and sacred protector of the realm. Beyond coronation, kings sometimes wore the crown publicly on special occasions. These crown wearings were rare, formal displays of authority, not casual habits. They brought together the great men of the kingdom and reinforced hierarchy and loyalty. Over time, the practice declined, though it could be revived in moments of crisis. Both Stephen and Richard, the only kings of this period to be captured by enemies, underwent special recrowning ceremonies after their release. These events were designed to erase the shame of captivity and publicly restore full royal authority. Later, kings followed similar patterns, using repeated coronations to mark political turning points and legal boundaries. Royal power was also believed to carry healing force. From an early date, English kings were thought to cure a specific disease by touch. This ability was linked to their anointing and sacred status. Though rarely mentioned, the belief persisted and reinforced the idea that kingship was not merely political but divinely charged. Although kings stood apart from other lords through ceremony, ritual, and sacred symbolism, they were still lords at heart. They exercised power in many of the same ways as earls, barons, and bishops. Authority did not exist in abstraction, it lived inside the household. Around every ruler stood a dense human world made up of family members, companions, armed followers, officials, clerics, and servants. This household was the true stage of power, where rule was displayed, enforced, and experienced on a daily basis. The splendour of such households could be overwhelming. To step inside the circle of a great lord was to enter a world of wealth, movement, and constant activity. Fine horses, richly dressed knights, gleaming vessels, elaborate meals, and brilliantly clothed attendants were not mere luxury. They were political statements. Display mattered. Consumption mattered. Magnificence was itself a form of authority. Households were not fixed in size. They expanded and contracted depending on circumstance. Times of war, great festivals, journeys, or major councils required far larger retinues than routine daily life. Kings maintained the largest households of all. Records from the early 12th century show that the royal household included well over 100 regular officers and servants, not counting hunters, guests, and the separate followings of other members of the royal family. It was a moving institution, part palace, part camp, part administrative machine. The household was carefully organised into specialised sections. Each had its own responsibilities. Some were concerned with worship, others with food, drink, lodging, transport, security or horses. Roles were precisely defined, often layered one beneath another. Even the humblest task had its place in the system. Everyone received a daily allowance, whether in money, food, drink or light. Rank was visible not only in authority, but in the size of one's candle and the quality of one's wine. Great lords organised their households in much the same way as kings. Monasteries, bishoprics, and aristocratic families followed similar patterns. Each major space of the residence was overseen by an official. The hall, the chamber, the kitchen, the door, the pantry, the buttery, and the stables were all managed separately. Order was essential, because the household was not only a place of living, but also the centre of lordship itself. Some household offices carried real power. The steward was among the most important figures, responsible for enforcing judgments, managing affairs, and representing the lord in serious matters. Other offices, such as chamberlain or butler, could also become influential over time. Many of these roles were held across generations. Service in a household often led to land, status, and lasting advancement. What began as practical duty could become hereditary authority. Household service created one of the greatest paths of social mobility in the medieval world. People from very different backgrounds could enter the orbit of power through service. Once inside, talent, loyalty, and opportunity mattered more than birth alone. Managing food could lead to managing finances. Writing letters could lead to shaping law. Handling horses could lead to commanding men. The household quietly trained administrators, soldiers, and rulers. These households were almost always on the move. Kings, bishops, and magnates owned lands scattered across wide regions. They travelled constantly between them, driven by administration, ceremony, hunting, justice, and politics. A royal court might remain only a few nights in one place before moving on again. Life at the centre of power was defined by movement. Because of this constant travel, the household had to be portable. Beds, tents, tables, cooking equipment, clothing, vessels, and chapel furnishings were transported by carts and pack animals. Careful planning was required. Bakers were sent ahead to prepare bread. Supplies were organised in advance. The speed of travel was limited by the wagons, not the riders. Even so, the court could cover impressive distances over time. The arrival of a great household was a major event for any community. Long processions of servants, animals, wagons, officials, and nobles filled roads and villages. Music, banners, hunting dogs, horses, and falcons turned travel into spectacle. Such entries impressed, intimidated, and sometimes overwhelmed local populations. Power announced itself not only through commands, but through presence. Yet life on the road was not glamorous for everyone. Competition for lodgings could turn violent. Disputes over sleeping space sometimes erupted into brawls and bloodshed. The strain of travel, uncertainty, and overcrowding bred resentment. Even those close to power complained bitterly about the discomfort, corruption, and unpredictability of court life. Decisions changed without warning. Plans collapsed overnight. Exhaustion was constant. Despite these hardships, itineration was not simply forced by necessity. It was chosen. Moving allowed lords to supervise officials directly, hear complaints, display authority, and prevent local power from slipping beyond control. When the court arrived, justice followed. Abuses were exposed, authority was renewed, lordship was exercised in motion. Residences played a crucial role in this system. Kings and magnates built networks of houses, halls, lodges and castles across their lands. These served as staging points for travel. Townhouses and monastic lodgings added flexibility. Hunting lodges were especially favoured as rulers preferred to remain close to forests and game. Where no residence existed, hospitality was demanded from tenants and vassals, sometimes under formal obligation. The architectural heart of the household was the hall. Large halls were built across the kingdom by kings, bishops, and nobles. They were spaces of gathering, feasting, judgment, and display. Royal halls were the grandest of all, some of the largest buildings in Europe. Alongside them stood chambers, kitchens, cellars, chapels, and courtyards, forming complex centres of power. Alongside movement came assembly. Instead of visiting every corner of the kingdom, kings regularly summoned the leading men to them. Bishops, abbots, earls, and barons gathered at great councils to advise, witness, and consent. These meetings served political, ceremonial, and administrative purposes. They were occasions of decision-making, negotiation, and immense consumption. Such assemblies could draw thousands. Each magnate arrived with a retinue. Business of the highest importance was handled at these gatherings. Successions were confirmed, laws were discussed, officials were dismissed or appointed, major disputes were settled. These were not private decisions made in isolation, but public acts performed before the elite of the realm. Advice mattered. Lords were expected to seek counsel, and vassals were expected to give it. Kings spoke the language of consent even when power lay firmly in their hands. While the reality behind these claims varied, evidence suggests that rulers often listened. Decisions were debated. Council shaped outcomes. Over time, these assemblies began to change in character. Toward the end of the period, new forms appeared in which knights from each county were summoned, not as individual vassals, but as representatives. Though limited and experimental, these meetings hinted at a new idea, that communities could speak through selected men. This principle would later become central to political life. Territorial administration underpinned all of this. England was divided into a remarkably uniform network of counties. Each was governed by a royal official responsible for justice and finance. This system covered almost the entire kingdom and endured for centuries with little alteration. Counties were small enough to be meaningful units of local life, yet firmly tied to royal authority. The sheriff stood at the centre of county government. Appointed by the king, he collected revenues, presided over courts, and enforced royal commands. Kings needed sheriffs with enough status to command respect, but not so much that they became independent. Balancing authority and control was a constant challenge. Over time, kings refined their grip on local officials. They dismissed corrupt sheriffs, rotated offices, and increasingly replaced powerful local figures with professional administrators. Financial pressure was constant. Sheriffs paid heavily for their positions and were expected to deliver increasing sums. Under tighter supervision, royal income grew. Central authority strengthened. One of the strongest forces shaping local identity in medieval England was the county court. This was not just a legal institution, but a social space where the county learned to see itself as a community. In earlier centuries, these courts met only a few times a year, but over time they became far more frequent. By the 12th century, royal authority struggled to restrain them. Kings issued commands limiting when and where courts could gather, which strongly suggests that local people were already meeting more often and in more flexible locations. These attempts failed. By the early 13th century, county courts were sometimes assembling every few weeks, to the frustration of royal officials. County courts did not meet in a single fixed place. Sometimes they gathered in the county town, sometimes in castles, churches, or even gardens. What mattered was space and accessibility, not symbolism. These gatherings brought together landholders from across the shire. The sheriff usually presided, collecting fines and enforcing decisions, though in special cases royal officers might take control. Attendance was expected from those who held land, but obligations could be delegated. A steward might represent a great lord, while particular tenants could be formally assigned the duty of attendance. In practice, Participation varied, but the court remained a regular point of contact between local society and authority. What made these courts powerful was not simply their legal role, but their memory. Custom mattered deeply. Procedures were rarely written down. Instead, knowledge was preserved orally by men who had attended courts for decades. When disputes arose, arguments often rested not on documents, but on what had always been done. Elderly landholders could carry enormous weight, presenting themselves as living witnesses to long-standing practice. Their authority came from experience, not office. This reliance on memory gave county courts a distinctive character. Each county developed its own habits, rhythms and expectations. Even royal legal writers hesitated to describe county courts in detail, acknowledging that local customs differed too much to be easily summarised. Through regular participation, landholders learned to think in county terms. Loyalty, identity and obligation were increasingly framed around the shire. Royal government treated counties as practical units. Taxes, inquirers and administrative commands were issued on a county basis. Official messages were often addressed not to individuals but to the collective body of the county's leading men. Yet counties were not passive recipients of authority. There is clear evidence that landholders acted together, defended shared interests, and expressed loyalty to their own shire. This sense of belonging sometimes emerged most strongly in opposition. One recurring demand was that the sheriff should be a local man. Communities believed that only someone rooted in the county could act fairly. On several occasions, counties offered large sums of money in exchange for the right to have a sheriff chosen from among their own leading figures. These offers reveal both solidarity and a desire to limit outside interference. Tensions could run high when sheriffs came from elsewhere. Court records preserve bitter exchanges in which local men insisted on their status as native and respectable members of the county while attacking officials as outsiders. Such arguments were often blunt, even crude, but they show how deeply county identity could be felt. Loyalty to the shire could override respect for office. County sentiment was not confined to courts and administration. It could become emotional and even poetic. Satirical verses circulated, mocking entire counties as foolish or corrupt. These attacks were often met with fierce local responses, defending the honour, fertility, courage and intelligence of the county's people. Pride in one's shire could be intense. The county was not merely an administrative unit. It could be loved, defended and celebrated. Despite this strong local identity, counties were relatively small. They were the largest secular subdivisions of the kingdom, with no intermediate layer between them and the crown. Earlier regional divisions survived only as names and memories. Older territorial identities lingered in language and habit, but they no longer shaped political reality. By the 12th century, counties were the framework through which royal authority and local life interacted. England at this time combined diversity with remarkable uniformity. Local customs varied widely. Measurements differed from place to place. Dialects could be hard to understand across regions, and regional prejudice was common. Yet politically, England was unusually coherent. The county system helped make this possible, creating a shared structure that connected village life to royal government. Below the county lay smaller units. Hundreds and wapentakes formed the next layer, each with its own court meeting every few weeks. Attendance was expected from local landholders. Twice a year, these courts held larger sessions focused on collective responsibility, ensuring that every free man belonged to a group accountable for its members' behaviour. This system compensated for the lack of a professional police force, making communities responsible for maintaining order. Hundreds were more easily transferred than counties. Kings often granted them to monasteries, bishops or nobles, allowing these lords to collect profits and preside over courts. Over time, many hundreds passed into private hands. Royal authority remained watchful, aware that justice and revenue could slip away if these grants went unchecked. At the lowest level stood the township. This was a corporate body with clear responsibilities. Villagers were required to provide representatives for inquiries, courts, and tax assessments. Crime reporting relied heavily on township participation. Ordinary people were drawn into the machinery of justice and administration, whether they wished it or not. This layered structure made large-scale taxation possible. When the Crown imposed taxes on property or income, the process reached deep into local society. Knights, reeves, villagers, and sworn representatives assessed wealth down to livestock, tools, and grain. Records were written, copied, and stored. Even remote communities were integrated into a national fiscal system. England, by medieval standards, was remarkably well organised. Royal finance rested on several pillars. The king was a vast landowner, drawing income from estates scattered across almost every county. Unlike rulers elsewhere in Europe, the English king possessed land throughout his realm, ensuring a physical presence of royal power everywhere. These estates were usually not managed directly. Instead, they were leased out or included in fixed payments made by sheriffs, providing predictable income with minimal administration. Royal landholding was not static. Estates were granted to reward loyalty, seized after rebellion, and reclaimed through inheritance failures. Such transfers served political purposes but reduced steady income. At the same time, confiscations and wardships brought land temporarily back into royal hands, creating opportunities for profit and patronage. Beyond land income, the crown benefited from its rights as a feudal lord. Payments were expected on inheritance, marriage, and minority. Control over the heirs of landholders could be extremely profitable. These rights were increasingly exploited, leading to growing resentment. Attempts to regulate and limit them became a central political issue. Military obligations were often converted into money payments. What began as a substitute for knight service gradually came to resemble a general land levy. Rates rose and demands became more frequent. Though not universal in theory, this system spread its burden widely in practice. Taxation went further still. England developed a land tax that applied across the kingdom, assessed through long-established fiscal units. Though rates fluctuated and exemptions existed, this tax provided a steady source of income. Later, extraordinary levies on property and income were introduced, sometimes at astonishing rates. These required intrusive assessments, drawing clergy, officials, and local representatives into close cooperation. Church structures were essential in proclaiming, organising, and enforcing these taxes. Such measures brought royal government into everyday life. Assessments recorded the possessions of peasants in minute detail. Oxen, cows, tools, and even small household items were counted and valued. The machinery of state depended on experienced local administrators who combined loyalty to the crown with knowledge of their county. These men formed the backbone of English government for generations. The king was seen as the ultimate source of justice, but access to that justice was never automatic. Royal judgment did not flow freely to everyone who sought it. Legal action often began with a royal order, and those orders had to be paid for. Even routine access to royal justice required money. By the late 12th century, some basic legal permissions could be obtained for relatively modest sums, but even these costs were significant for ordinary landholders. More complex cases demanded far larger payments, sometimes equivalent to many months of income from the land under dispute. Justice was available, but it was never free. For those with wealth and ambition, these costs were worth paying. A favourable ruling could decide the ownership of estates, titles, and long-term power. The crown profited regardless of the outcome. Legal conflict became both a mechanism of justice and a source of royal income. Some litigants recorded their experiences in detail, revealing how long and expensive such journeys could be. Cases might last for years, involve travel across regions, and require repeated payments at every stage. Bribes, fees, and gifts were treated as part of the process. The pursuit of justice could drain fortunes as effectively as war. These sums involved could be enormous. Leading nobles were prepared to offer hundreds of pounds to secure royal attention or formal investigation. Sometimes payment was required even if the case was lost. Justice at the highest level was inseparable from negotiation, influence and money. The king's courts were places where land, authority and wealth were redistributed. Criminal justice also produced income, though usually on a smaller scale. Fines, confiscations and penalties flowed steadily into the royal treasury. Even a single violent crime could generate a chain of payments. Fines imposed on communities, forfeiture of property, penalties for officials who failed in their duties. Justice was not only moral correction, it was financial extraction. A special and feared branch of royal justice operated under the law of the forest. These forests were not simply wooded areas, but zones placed under special royal authority. Their original purpose was to protect hunting rights, but enforcement went far beyond that. Clearing land, keeping animals, or even moving through forested areas could result in heavy fines. Forest justice became one of the most profitable arms of the royal system. Special judicial tours raised vast sums, often provoking widespread resentment. Officials who enforced forest law gained reputations for harshness. Their methods bordered on extortion, yet the crown rarely rejected the revenue they produced. Complaints circulated for decades, and local communities remembered these abuses long after the officials themselves were dead. The hatred of forest law was so strong that counties were sometimes willing to pay large sums simply to have their land removed from forest jurisdiction. When royal authority weakened, one of the first demands was the removal of forest restrictions. Royal finances can be seen clearly by examining how individual counties were managed. Sheriffs acted as the financial agents of the crown, delivering fixed sums while accounting for expenses, exemptions and losses. Every payment was recorded, down to wages paid for guarding royal property or maintaining hunting lodges. Income from farming, towns, churches and special levies all flowed through this system. Money collected in rural counties was used to fund distant wars and royal ambitions far from home. Over time, the scale of royal finance expanded dramatically. County accounts grew longer, more complex and more detailed. New sources of income appeared alongside older ones. Judicial fines, negotiated payments, forest revenues and extraordinary levies became increasingly important. Royal government learned to compensate for shortfalls in regular income by squeezing additional payments wherever possible. This system rested on two foundations: vast royal landholdings and the ability to tax the population. Beyond recorded income, kings benefited from many uncounted resources. Game from royal hunts fed the court. Gifts flowed in without being written down. War brought plunder and ransoms. Some of this wealth escaped the records entirely, but it sustained royal power all the same. Over the long term, royal income increased, but not as fast as prices. Inflation eroded purchasing power, especially in the early 13th century. Although kings extracted more silver than their predecessors, food, animals and supplies cost far more. Political crises could cause sudden collapses in revenue. Civil war, rebellion, and instability disrupted even the most efficient systems. Justice itself operated through a web of courts. Disputes might be heard at the level of the manor, the hundred, the county, or before royal judges. These courts overlapped rather than forming a clean hierarchy. Cases moved from one forum to another. Local courts handled minor matters and preserved custom. Royal courts intervened in serious disputes, especially those involving land, violence, or high-status individuals. Lords exercised authority over their own followers. This right was widely accepted and recognised by the crown. Powerful churchmen and nobles could hold courts that judged even serious crimes. Some institutions possessed sweeping judicial authority over entire regions. The king stood above them all, able to judge personally or through appointed officials who acted in his name. Legal procedure relied heavily on sworn statements. Oaths played a central role. Accusations, defences, and verdicts were bound to promises made before God. Truth was not simply established by evidence, but by invoking divine witness. Documents and testimony mattered, but spiritual commitment carried enormous weight. When oaths were not enough, cases turned to ordeals. These were tests believed to reveal divine judgment directly. Some involved physical trials, others violent combat. Battle was understood not as brute force, but as a sacred contest in which God would grant victory to the righteous. This belief gave moral meaning to violence within the courtroom. These trials were dangerous and unpredictable. Success depended on strength, skill, and luck as much as innocence. Those who lost faced disgrace, punishment, or death. Clergy and townspeople increasingly sought exemption from such methods, recognizing their cruelty and uncertainty. Alternatives slowly emerged, but ordeals remained central for much of the period. Punishment was harsh and public. Shame, mutilation, exile, and execution were all used to enforce order. Public humiliation reinforced communal norms. Severe crimes could lead to hanging, dismemberment, or burning. Authorities believed that visible suffering deterred others. Mercy was occasionally shown, but terror was an accepted tool of governance. The royal court reserved special anger for crimes that threatened royal authority. Tampering with coinage, rebellion, and treason provoked brutal responses. Kings argued that mutilation was more merciful than death, but it also served as a warning. Bodies became instruments of policy. What emerges from this system is a form of justice that was deeply entwined with power, money, belief, and fear. Courts were not neutral spaces. They were arenas where authority was displayed, negotiated, and enforced. Justice was public, physical, and spiritual at once. It shaped behaviour not only through law but through spectacle. Punishment after private accusations in medieval England could be brutal, personal, and deeply public. When a man was defeated in a private appeal, the law often allowed the accuser to carry out the sentence himself. Justice was not only declared in court, it was enacted by the very hands of those who had brought the charge. A striking example comes from the early 13th century. A man named Thomas from a village in western England was defeated in trial by combat after being accused of violent assault. By custom, such a defeat could have led directly to execution. Yet the royal judges chose what they described as mercy. Instead of death, they ordered mutilation. They instructed the victor's relatives to enforce the punishment. What followed was savage. The sentence was carried out with enthusiasm, driven less by justice than by vengeance. The scene turned into a spectacle of cruelty that shocked even contemporaries. Personal resentment and past relationships only deepened the violence. The law had spoken, but it was human rage that completed the act. Such punishments rarely occurred in silence. Ordeals, executions, and mutilations drew crowds. They were meant to be seen. Hanging, in particular, was a public ritual. Victims were bound, blinded, and chained before being led to the gallows. In some cases, bodies were left on display long after death, serving as a warning. Religious consolation was often denied. Some condemned men were refused communion and buried beside the gallows rather than in sacred ground. There was no official executioner. The task was often forced upon whoever happened to be nearby, rewarded with the condemned person's clothes or a small payment. Prisons existed but were not central to medieval justice in the modern sense. Royal jails were established in major towns and castles, and sheriffs regularly accounted for the cost of maintaining them. Imprisonment served many purposes. It could secure suspects before trial, pressure litigants into compliance, or punish certain offences. Sometimes it was clearly judicial. At other times, it blurred into coercion. A widow who refused to continue a murder accusation could find herself jailed until she agreed to pay a fine. Prison was both punishment and leverage. Debt could also lead to confinement. Those who owed money to the crown might be imprisoned until payment was arranged. Some were held in harsh conditions, others in relatively free custody. The goal was rarely long-term incarceration. The aim was compliance. Still, fixed-term imprisonment did exist. For some offences, especially under forest law, those unable to pay fines were confined for a year and a day. Prisons had become a recognised tool within the machinery of justice. For lesser offences, monetary penalties were the norm. These fines varied enormously, from modest sums imposed for procedural mistakes to massive payments demanded from nobles. Justice produced revenue. This had long been accepted. Offenders paid to escape harsher penalties. Failed litigants paid for losing. Jurors paid if they contradicted themselves. Law and income were tightly bound. Legal proceedings themselves were elaborate performances. Lawsuits were dramas shaped as much by politics and social pressure as by rules. Parties gathered allies, negotiated behind the scenes, and tested the boundaries of custom. Legal knowledge was uneven. Precedent was debated. Outcomes were rarely inevitable. A vivid picture of how trials worked emerges from contemporary storytelling. In one famous narrative, a powerful noble accused of murder returns from exile to seek judgment. Before appearing in court, he mobilizes supporters and secures permission to be heard. He offers pledges and guarantors. Even access to justice must be negotiated. The king formally accuses him of a grave crime. The noble responds with a precise ritual denial, word for word. The case then passes to the assembled magnates who act as judges. They withdraw to deliberate. What follows is not a mechanical application of law but a debate. Some argue that such a charge requires witnesses. Others insist that proof by ordeal or combat is necessary. Still others reject both, proposing an agreed settlement instead. Political reality weighs heavily. The king's authority matters, so does the desire for peace. In the end, the case is resolved not by ordeal or battle, but by arbitration. The accused submits, offers rich gifts, and acknowledges the king's authority. Justice is achieved without blood. Honour is preserved. Order is restored. This was not unusual. Law in this period was flexible, negotiated, and deeply human. From such debates emerged a growing body of legal thought. Law books, royal ordinances, and clerical writings began to appear. These texts were not abstract theory. They reflected arguments heard in courts and councils. Learned discussion mixed scripture, custom, and lived experience. Bishops, judges, and administrators all contributed. Law was shaped in conversation as much as in parchment. The most profound changes came under royal authority. In the later 12th century, the crown reorganised justice on a national scale. Travelling royal judges were sent across the country in regular circuits. They heard cases county by county, dealing with criminal matters, land disputes, royal rights, taxation, and administrative abuses. Their workload was enormous. At the same time, a permanent royal court developed at Westminster. Civil cases increasingly flowed there. A professional judiciary began to emerge. Some judges served for decades, creating continuity and expertise. Justice became more predictable, more technical, and more centralized. New legal procedures transformed land disputes. Instead of ordeal or combat, simple questions were put to local juries. Was someone unlawfully dispossessed? Was an heir entitled to inherit? These cases were fast, focused, and popular. Decisions were based on sworn verdicts, not divine tests. Gradually, juries replaced ordeals even in criminal cases. When church authorities withdrew support for ordeals, the jury was ready to fill the gap. By the early 13th century, trial by ordeal had vanished from English courts. Trial by jury had taken its place. Between the middle of the 12th century and the early 13th, English justice was transformed. Land litigation moved into royal courts. Professional judges applied uniform procedures. Verdicts replaced divine signs. a common system of law took shape across the kingdom. At the same time, government began to leave an ever deeper written trail. Records multiplied. Orders, accounts, surveys, and judgments were written down. The Great Land Survey of the late 11th century stood alone in its scale, but later generations built something different: continuous documentation. Royal officials kept annual financial accounts. Debts were recorded and carried forward year after year. Written memory ensured nothing was forgotten. Lords and monasteries compiled surveys of their lands and tenants. They updated them. They compared them. Writing became a tool of control. Church institutions copied their charters into books so their rights could be consulted easily. Royal government went further. From the reign of John onward, outgoing letters and charters were systematically recorded. Legal agreements were archived. Judicial proceedings were written down. Daily political history became visible for the first time. Clerks became essential. Administration grew more complex. Specialized offices emerged. Archives expanded. What had once been personal lordship evolved into structured government. Medieval England, like much of pre-industrial Europe, was an aristocratic society. Wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of a very small elite. A tiny number of families controlled an extraordinary share of the country's resources. Evidence from large surveys of landholding shows that roughly half of all income produced in England was held by fewer than 200 great lords. Everything else flowed to the crown or to the church. These families formed a narrow ruling group. Their favour determined the future of lesser lineages, and their rivalries and alliances shaped the politics of the kingdom. Even within this elite, inequality was immense. Some magnates controlled hundreds of estates spread across many regions and earned sums that placed them among the richest individuals in Europe. Others, still counted among the aristocracy, held only a handful of properties and lived on incomes closer to those of prosperous knights. Aristocratic society was therefore not a single level, but a steep slope, with vast distance between its upper and lower edges. Great lords did not manage their lands directly. Large estates were broken up and distributed to followers in return for service. Some lands produced food or rent for the lord's household, but many were granted out to men who owed obligations in return. These obligations could include military service, guarding castles, attending councils, or providing money in times of need. These relationships were formalized through public rituals that marked loyalty and dependence. A man became bound to a lord, and that bond defined his place within a wider network of authority. English aristocratic society was shaped by two overlapping hierarchies. One was economic, based simply on how much land and income a person possessed. The other was relational, based on personal bonds of loyalty and service. These two systems quickly became entangled. A man might be wealthy, yet owe loyalty to someone poorer. Another might hold land from several superiors at the same time. This complexity produced confusion as well as flexibility, and it explains why medieval politics often involved divided loyalties. Land was not owned outright in the modern sense. It was held from someone else. Only the king stood at the top of this pyramid without a superior. Because of this, several people could claim different rights over the same piece of land. A local tenant might manage an estate, while a greater lord and the king himself still regarded that land as part of their authority. In times of inheritance, war or royal demand, those higher claims could suddenly become very real. The result was a dense web of obligation. Large estates became networks rather than unified properties. Lords presided over groups of tenants and subtenants, many of whom had their own followers in turn. These ties could last for generations. Families remained attached to the same lordly house across decades, sometimes centuries, creating long memories of loyalty and expectation. Because authority flowed through multiple layers, even a simple gift of land could involve many parties. A grant made by a knight might require approval from his immediate lord, that lord's superior, and finally the king. Each layer of authority had to consent. Land carried different obligations depending on who was viewing it. One person saw income, another military service, another political influence. Medieval society accepted this complexity as normal. Titles and social labels reflected relationships rather than fixed rank. Words like lord, vassal, tenant or man described connections, not wealth or status. A vassal could be richer than his lord. A lord could be socially elevated but financially modest. Alongside these relational terms existed broader social categories that ranked people by prestige. Official documents and royal orders reveal how society was grouped for practical purposes. Men were classified by wealth when determining military equipment or financial obligations. Elsewhere, hierarchy appeared through rank and title. These systems blended status and money, but they didn't always align perfectly. A poor knight and a wealthy merchant could occupy very different positions economically, while being treated quite differently by custom and law. Literary sources from the period imagined society as a ladder. At the top stood bishops and abbots, followed by earls, barons and knights. Beneath them came townspeople, craftsmen, and finally peasants. Yet this ladder was descriptive rather than legal. There was no single noble class defined by law. The sharpest boundary in English society was not between noble and commoner, but between free and unfree. Language reflected this reality. Words meaning noble, well-born, powerful or great appear frequently, but they were used loosely. They did not mark a legally defined group. Sometimes writers divided society simply into free men and unfree labourers. Under English law, all free men were protected in the same basic way, regardless of how rich or poor they were. Formal titles were surprisingly rare in everyday documents. Even men who would later be recognised as knights or magnates were often named without rank. What mattered more than titles was land, loyalty and reputation. Status was assumed rather than announced. Among all aristocratic distinctions, one title stood above the rest: Earl. This was the highest formal rank available to laymen. Earls formed a tiny elite within an already narrow aristocracy. Their number remained small for most of the period, and the title carried enormous prestige. An earl's authority was tied to a region, and with the title came a share of local revenues. This income symbolised the earl's special standing rather than providing the bulk of his wealth. The creation of earls varied by reign. Some kings granted the title sparingly, others more freely in times of crisis. Periods of civil war saw a sudden rise in the number of earls, followed by long phases of restraint. Over time, the title became more stable, passed through families and recognised even through female inheritance. By the early 13th century, the number of earls had settled at around 20. Earls were not always the most active figures in politics or war. Many relied on their land, kinship ties, and inherited prestige rather than constant public action. Some families rose to prominence simply by remaining where they were, generation after generation, at the top of society. Below the earls stood the barons. The term originally meant a substantial follower of a lord, not necessarily of the king. Great lords, churches and monasteries all had their own barons. Over time, however, the word increasingly came to describe major tenants, who held land directly from the crown. There was no exact boundary between barons and lesser lords. Size of estate, income and military obligation all played a role. By modern estimates, England probably had between 100 and 200 baronial families at any one time. Their incomes varied widely. Some were wealthier than earls, others only marginally richer than well-established knights. Below the barons stood the knights, a group defined in several different ways. A knight could be understood as a heavily armed mounted warrior. He could also be a man who had undergone a formal ceremony marking his status, or he could be a member of a social layer that stood between great lords and ordinary free men. These meanings did not always overlap. A man might fit one definition but not the others. Not every knight in medieval England owned land. Some lived without estates of their own and attached themselves to the households of powerful lords. These men served where they were needed, in halls or castles, hoping that loyal service might one day be rewarded with land. They formed a mobile and ambitious group within aristocratic society. Records from the mid-12th century show that even great lords maintained such followers. Some knights held only very modest properties, bringing in small incomes that were not enough to support a fully independent life. These men often lived with their lord, relying on him for food, clothing and protection. Others were stationed in frontier castles, where their daily lives revolved around military readiness and service. Compared to household knights with no land at all, they were fortunate, but their status remained uncertain and dependent. Once a knight received a permanent estate, his situation changed fundamentally. Land allowed him to settle, to establish a household, and to pass property on to his children. Over time, this process created local knightly families rooted in particular counties. These men usually held one or two manors and became familiar figures in local society. They attended county courts, served as royal officials, managed estates for greater lords, and formed the backbone of local administration. Such families often endured for generations. Some can be traced across a century or more, holding the same lands under the same lordly house. Their fortunes rose and fell with those of their patrons. Loyal service could bring advancement and new offices. Political miscalculation could bring ruin and confiscation. Yet many survived these risks and gradually strengthened their position. As these lineages multiplied, knighthood increasingly came to be seen as a family quality rather than a purely personal role. Some families were regarded as knightly by birth, even if individual members never fought as mounted warriors or underwent formal ceremonies. In this sense, knighthood became a social identity that could include women as well as men. Descent from knightly ancestors was considered an asset, enhancing prestige and marriage prospects. Legal reforms of the Angevin period further elevated the importance of knights. Many new judicial and administrative roles were reserved exclusively for them. Knights were required to serve on juries in major land disputes, to verify claims of illness, to carry legal records, and to hold offices such as county coroner. As royal justice expanded, these duties increased. Knights became essential agents of government. This growing reliance on knights made it necessary to define clearly who belonged to this group. As a result, records from around the year 1200 allow us to estimate their numbers with some confidence. Although thousands of land units were assessed for military service, not all were held by knights. Careful analysis suggests that England probably had between 4,500 and 5,000 knights at this time. Knighthood also carried privileges. Even a knight who fell into debt retained certain protections. If imprisoned, he was kept under lighter conditions than ordinary prisoners. His horse could not be taken from him, ensuring that he would not be reduced to walking like a common man. Such rules reflected the growing recognition of a knighthood as a social rank. By the late 12th century, the title of knight appeared more frequently in official documents. Men increasingly asserted their status openly, even in contexts where earlier generations would have remained unnamed. Knighthood was becoming a clearly marked position within society. Below the level of knights existed a broad and varied group occupying the margins of the aristocracy. These were free men who lived from rents and services rather than manual labour, yet did not belong to the knightly class. Some possessed incomes comparable to those of knights, but held land under different conditions. Others served lords in specialised ways that did not involve mounted warfare. One important form of such service involved holding land in return for specific duties. These duties could be administrative, military or domestic. Men might be responsible for guarding royal property, escorting treasure, maintaining hunting animals, or enforcing local law. The size of their holdings varied widely, from respectable estates to very small plots. These men were free, but their work sometimes included physical labour. Despite this diversity, some of these tenants occupied an intermediate social position. They attended courts, advised their lords, managed estates, and cultivated networks of influence. They often held land from more than one lord, acting as links between different centres of power. Monastic institutions in particular valued such tenants, who provided income, companionship, and protection. Agreements between religious houses and these tenants reveal relationships of mutual obligation. Tenants owed loyalty, attendance, hospitality, and service. In return, they received land, protection, and honourable recognition. Burial within a church was a significant mark of status. These men were free, respected, and distinct from peasants, yet not knights. They resemble what later centuries would call the lesser gentry. At the top of aristocratic society stood the great estates known as honours. These were large collections of manors held under military obligation. They were not compact territories, but scattered networks of land across many counties. What bound them together was not geography, but common lordship. Honours developed their own administrative identity. Even when they passed into royal hands, they were often treated as separate units. They could be granted, managed, and accounted for as a whole. Over time, they became stable features of the political landscape. The honour functioned differently from the county. County authority applied to everyone within a geographic boundary. The honour bound together a lord's followers wherever they lived. Tenants owed service to their lord rather than to a place. Which bond mattered more depended on circumstance. Honours had their own courts, where lords and tenants met to conduct business, resolve disputes, and confirm transactions. These courts reinforced a sense of belonging among tenants. They were public gatherings that combined law, ceremony, and social interaction. Yet honorial courts were not always harmonious. Disputes between lords and their own men could arise, especially over services and obligations. Tenants sometimes feared injustice or retaliation, and avoided appearing before their lord. Denial of justice was considered a serious offence and could justify extreme actions. Periods of weak royal authority intensified these conflicts. Some tenants used disorder as an opportunity to reduce their obligations. Others resisted ecclesiastical lords who lacked military power. Disputes over service were common and persistent. Royal legal reforms gradually reduced the importance of lordly courts in land disputes. Access to royal justice became easier, and attractive procedures were available only at the king's courts. As a result, fewer disputes were finally settled at the level of the honour. This did not mean the end of lordly power. Lords continued to depend on networks of kin, tenants, retainers, and friends. Relationships varied in strength and intimacy. Some tenants remained close companions, others were linked only by formal obligation. Knights remained a crucial pool from which lords recruited active supporters. Aristocratic wealth rested on land, rents, agricultural production, and legal rights. A knight's holding was meant to support one mounted warrior, but in practice such holdings varied enormously in size and value. Some were vast, others modest. Income ranged widely, and assessments were often shaped by politics rather than reality. A single knight's estate could include rents from tenants, labour services, farmland worked directly by the lord, mills, markets, and church patronage. These resources were often scattered and intermingled with the lands of others. A knight's fee was not a single block of land, but a complex bundle of rights and incomes. Baronial estates operated on the same principles, only on a larger scale. They combined rents, agricultural sales, court profits, and payments from military tenants. Some included towns, which provided additional income from markets and legal rights. Even relatively modest baronies produced revenues far beyond those of individual knights. Despite differences in scale, aristocrats shared a common legal framework. Land was generally secure and peaceful inheritance was favoured. Lords retained important rights, including inheritance payments and control over minor heirs. These limits meant that landholders never enjoyed absolute ownership. inheritance rules increasingly favoured direct descent within the family. Eldest sons usually inherited military holdings. Other forms of land followed different patterns, sometimes being divided among heirs. Collateral inheritance through brothers and uncles was recognised, strengthening continuity within lineages. Daughters could inherit when there were no sons, and such inheritances were common. Estates might be divided among sisters, fragmenting holdings and transferring land into new families through marriage. Aristocratic families lived with this uncertainty. Landholders had limited freedom to dispose of their property. Testamentary control was restricted. Gifts and grants often required the consent of heirs and lords. Acquired land was treated more flexibly than inherited land, but negotiation remained central. Inheritance law was stable, but always open to bargaining. Royal favour mattered greatly. Even well-established rules could be influenced by politics, payment, and circumstance. In medieval England, land, power, and law were inseparable, and nothing of value was ever entirely secure. A common belief in the Middle Ages was that social position was carried in the blood. Society was imagined as something fixed at birth. Unfree peasants were defined by being born unfree, while the upper ranks were understood as people born high. In this worldview, escaping one's birth status was almost impossible. Medieval literature often repeated this idea, suggesting that even if someone of low origin rose in fortune, their true nature would always betray where they came from. The aristocracy of Anglo-Norman and Angevin England fully embraced this way of thinking. They believed their superiority rested not only on power or wealth, but on lineage itself. Nobility was seen as something inherited, flowing through generations. Writers who praised great lords emphasized ancestry and pedigree, tracing noble families back to kings and counts. Moral thinkers tried to separate true inner virtue from noble blood, but the very need to make that distinction shows how deeply rooted the idea of blood nobility was. Even churchmen who praised humility still assumed that noble lineage was real and meaningful. This belief naturally produced strong family pride. Aristocratic families saw themselves not just as households, but as extended networks bound by blood and marriage. Although the typical noble family was not especially large, it was embedded in a web of relatives who supported one another politically and socially. Powerful families became clans, recognized by contemporaries for their numbers, influence, and ability to dominate gatherings of the elite. Being connected to such a lineage brought protection and prestige. Yet birth alone was not enough. Aristocratic identity had to be performed. Bearing, speech, and behaviour marked someone as noble. Arrogance, confidence, and disdain for social inferiors were often seen as natural signs of high status. Even language reflected this attitude, as words associated with peasants gradually became insults. To act in a coarse or submissive way was to behave like a peasant, something the aristocracy defined itself against. Courage was another essential value. Noblemen were expected to face danger boldly and to accept death, whether their own or that of close kin, with composure. Stories of heroic ancestors were retold to reinforce this ideal. Bravery was not meant to be hidden. Men were expected to proclaim their resolve and to shame those who hesitated. This culture prized bold speech as much as bold action, reflecting an older warrior tradition in which honour was openly contested. Alongside courage stood loyalty. Lords and followers were bound together by mutual obligations. Faithfulness was expected to run both ways, with each side owing protection and support to the other. One concrete expression of this bond was ransom. Warfare produced prisoners, and rescuing a captured lord or follower was seen as a duty. Raising money for ransom demonstrated loyalty and generosity, virtues that were central to aristocratic identity. Generosity itself was deeply admired. Giving freely was seen as proof of noble spirit. Lavish gifts attracted followers, and followers increased power. Medieval writers often portrayed ideal rulers as open-handed leaders whose wealth flowed outward rather than being hoarded. Honour was earned in a competitive environment, however, and one person's glory often came at another's expense. Rivalry was intense, and reputation had to be constantly defended. Pride in rank did not erase individual ambition. For noblemen, knighthood marked a crucial transition. Young aristocrats were usually knighted in their late teens or early adulthood. The ceremony signalled entry into a new social and military role. Although descriptions of the ritual are sparse, the central act was being girded with a sword belt. This physical gesture symbolised admission into the knightly order. To be stripped of the belt was to lose honour and status. Knighting often followed years of training in the household of a great lord. Young men served as squires, learning arms, riding, and courtly behaviour before receiving their arms. The ceremony itself was often lavish, involving fine clothing, horses, and equipment. These displays were not incidental. They announced the new knight's place in society and his readiness to live up to its expectations. Aristocratic life more broadly was defined by display. Great households were noisy, crowded, and extravagant. Lords took pleasure in feasting, games, hunting, fine clothes, and magnificent surroundings. They consumed differently from the rest of society, favouring wine over ale, richly spiced foods, and luxurious fabrics. Such splendour reinforced social distance and made aristocratic life appear almost unreal to those outside it. Entertainment played an important role in this culture. Minstrels, jesters, and performers were common figures in noble households. Their presence reflected the value placed on amusement and public display. Some entertainers were rewarded with land or privileges, a sign of aristocratic generosity. Humour could be crude, and noble courts were often lively and boisterous rather than refined and restrained. Games such as chess and dice were popular pastimes. Chess, introduced from the Eastern world, became a favoured aristocratic game and a marker of knightly culture. Yet it was not a quiet intellectual exercise. Gambling was common, tempers flared, and disputes could turn violent. Even kings were not immune to such quarrels. These games reveal an aristocracy that combined leisure with aggression. Horses were central to noble identity. Riding was a fundamental skill, learned from childhood. Different types of horses reflected social distinctions, from powerful war horses to elegant riding horses, and more modest mounts for servants. Hunting on horseback was one of the defining activities of the elite. It shaped rural society by creating a class of huntsmen and falconers who served noble households and lived close to their lords. Hunting with hounds and birds of prey was especially prestigious. Kings and magnates guarded their rights to game jealously, enforcing strict laws that set them apart from lesser people. Falcons and hawks were prize gifts, symbols of favour and power. Hunts were grand, noisy events involving large retinues, specialised dogs, and elaborate equipment. They were also dangerous, and accidents were not uncommon. Over the course of the 12th century, this long-standing aristocratic way of life acquired new cultural features. One of the most important was the tournament. Originating on the continent, tournaments were mock battles between groups of mounted knights. They combined military training, spectacle, and the chance for profit, since victors could seize the arms and horses of the defeated. Tournaments were slow to take root in England. Early kings viewed large armed gatherings with suspicion and often banned them. Church leaders also condemned tournaments as sinful displays of pride and violence. Only during periods of weak authority did they flourish openly. When royal control strengthened, tournaments were pushed abroad, reinforcing the idea that England was a restrained and orderly land compared to northern France. Eventually, controlled tournaments were permitted under strict regulation. Licensing systems were introduced, fees were charged, and locations were limited. Even so, tournaments remained dangerous and politically sensitive. They could turn violent, attract disorderly followers, and become rallying points for opposition. Some ended in death, reminding everyone that these were not harmless games. By the early 13th century, tournaments still carried a distinctly foreign flavour, associated especially with French knightly culture. Despite official controls, they remained symbols of aristocratic aggression, rivalry, and display. They captured the spirit of a class that lived by honour, competition, and spectacle, always balancing between order and chaos. Tournaments stood at the crossroads of fame, military preparation, and profit. They were places where knights could win renown, harden themselves for war, and also make money. Critics of the age saw all these aspects clearly. Around the year 1200, a learned churchman attacked tournaments by describing knights who were willing to risk their lives for praise, caring little for their souls while chasing empty glory. This reflected an ancient heroic ideal, the belief that true honour was earned by facing danger, but also the equally ancient clerical suspicion of such reckless ambition. At the same time, tournaments were openly understood as training grounds. They were not random violence, but structured war games. Knights rehearsed combat under controlled conditions, learning how to fight on horseback, how to strike, how to fall, and how to endure pain. Those who had already tasted blood, been knocked down, or felt the crushing weight of an opponent were thought to enter real battle with greater confidence. Experience gained in tournaments translated directly into effectiveness in war. Yet honour and skill were not the only stakes. Tournaments also had a harsh economic side. Defeated knights were expected to pay ransoms, just as in real warfare. Some participants treated tournaments almost as businesses. Contemporary critics complained that certain knights made secret agreements, allowing inexperienced companions to be captured so that ransom money could be shared. Behind the shining ideals of chivalry lay calculation, greed, and exploitation. Despite moral criticism and official restrictions, tournaments became central to aristocratic life during the 12th century. To take part was, by definition, to live out knighthood. Displaying courage, strength, and control as a mounted warrior before a crowd was proof of belonging to the knightly elite. Pain, injury, moral lectures from churchmen, and attempts at regulation by kings all failed to curb the attraction. The tournament combined danger and beauty in a way that was irresistible to the aristocratic imagination. As tournaments flourished, new visual symbols emerged to express aristocratic identity. One of the most important was the seal. Wax seals were used to authenticate written commands and grants, and by the late Anglo-Saxon period, kings were already using them. After the Norman Conquest, rulers introduced a powerful new image by showing themselves both enthroned and armed on horseback. This visual language linked authority directly to military force. The great lords quickly adopted this style. Their seals typically showed them as mounted warriors, carrying weapons and shields. These images were not decorative. They projected power, status, and the right to command. Over time, the use of seals spread downward through society. At first, some officials resisted this spread, arguing that seals should belong only to kings and major lords. But the knightly class prevailed. By the early 13th century, towns, free landholders, and eventually even craftsmen and peasants were using seals. For seals to work, their designs had to remain consistent. Changing a seal could cast doubt on earlier documents. Kings sometimes altered their seals deliberately to mark political moments, and lesser lords also changed theirs on occasion. These shifts show how closely seals were tied to authority and identity. From seals developed an even more striking system of visual identity: heraldry. Warriors had long used symbols in battle, from banners to decorated shields. What was new in the 12th century was the creation of hereditary designs governed by clear rules. These coats of arms were not personal decorations but family emblems, passed down through generations and recognised across regions. Early heraldic designs appeared among the highest aristocracy. Simple geometric patterns or bold symbols were repeated on shields, banners, and seals, marking family identity. Over time, these designs became fixed, inherited, and regulated. It is no coincidence that heraldry emerged alongside tournaments. In the chaos of mounted combat, when faces were hidden by helmets, clear symbols were essential for identifying allies, enemies, and valuable opponents. Spectators, too, needed to recognize who was who in order to cheer, admire, and spread reputations. By the end of the 12th century, coats of arms were spreading beyond the great earls to lesser nobles and knights. A specialized vocabulary developed to describe colors, shapes, and positions, turning heraldry into a technical language understood by the elite. Carrying arms was never merely decorative. It signaled noble birth, family honour, and a place within the aristocratic order. Eventually, the right to bear arms itself became a marker of gentility. The symbols chosen were not random. Bright colours and simple shapes ensured visibility, while animals carried symbolic weight. The lion became the most popular creature on shields, representing ferocity and dominance, even though it was foreign to Northern Europe. Earlier animal symbols faded as this new imagery took over. In some cases, arms played on names, using visual puns that reinforced family identity and lineage. Alongside tournaments, seals, and heraldry, another powerful element reshaped aristocratic culture: storytelling. A new body of literature emerged in the spoken languages of the elite, telling stories that reflected and idealized noble life. Above all, the legends of King Arthur and his court captured the imagination of the aristocracy. Arthur had long been a figure of legend in Celtic-speaking regions, where many believed he would return. Early encounters show how fiercely this belief could be defended. Over time, however, Arthur was transformed from a local hero into a universal aristocratic ideal. This transformation was driven by a sweeping narrative that recast him as a conqueror, lawgiver, and model king. He subdued enemies, ruled a vast realm, and presided over a court that set the standard for noble behaviour across Europe. Arthur's court was portrayed as a place of unmatched splendour. Kings and nobles gathered there, displaying wealth, fine clothing, and magnificent horses. Feasts were lavish, ceremonies grand, and tournaments followed religious celebrations. Knights fought while ladies watched and urged them on, blending love, glory, and violence into a single idealized vision. These stories spread rapidly. They were copied, translated, and retold in aristocratic circles. Monastic writers noted how deeply people were moved by tales of Arthur, sometimes to the point of tears. Knowing these stories became fashionable. To be ignorant of them was to risk ridicule. Arthurian legend conquered not by force but by style, reshaping how nobles imagine themselves. Poets expanded the cycle, adding new elements such as the Round Table, which symbolized equality among knights and prevented quarrels over rank. Arthurian romances crossed borders, inspiring adaptations in different languages. Kings themselves engaged with the legend, sometimes promoting it, sometimes trying to control its political implications. The figure of Arthur was powerful and potentially dangerous, especially when linked to ideas of rightful rule and return. Not everyone believed Arthur had truly existed. By the early 13th century, calling something an Arthurian tale could mean dismissing it as fantasy. Yet belief mattered less than influence. Arthurian themes seeped into aristocratic life. Swords, banners, ceremonies, and even personal names reflected the stories that nobles admired. Tournaments adopted Arthurian imagery, calling themselves round tables. Romance and legend shaped real behaviour,